Section 1. The Divergence, a world that branched from ours. There is a moment, somewhere in the decades after the Second World War, where the world we know quietly splits. Not with a thunderclap, not with any particular headline, just a slow, almost invisible drift, like a river that gradually bends away from the course it was always supposed to take. In one direction flows our world, with its transistors and internet and fast food chains and all the noise and color that came with it. In the other direction flows the world of Fallout, and that world went somewhere entirely different. The divergence, as the lore and many fans call it, is not a single event but a gradual separation, a branching of possibility that becomes more pronounced with every passing decade. In the 1940s and early 1950s, the two timelines are nearly identical. World War II ended the same way. The atomic bomb fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Cold War began. The anxiety of mutual assured destruction settled over the world like a low-weather system that never quite broke. But in Fallout's timeline, the critical fork appears sometime around the late 1950s and early 1960s, where our world found its way to the silicon chip, to the microprocessor, to the explosion of digital technology that would define everything that came after Fallout's world went a different direction. Nuclear energy became the answer to everything. Fusion power, still theoretical in our world, became achievable in theirs, and that achievement reshaped the next century in ways that are visible in every object and every advertisement and every piece of architecture in the pre-war world. The games allow you to glimpse. The aesthetic consequence of this divergence is the most immediately striking thing about the Fallout universe. Everything looks like 1950s. Optimism extended forward without modification, an entire civilization that kept the visual language of post-war American consumerism, as though some catastrophic failure of imagination had locked the design sensibility in amber. The cars are enormous and rounded and run on fusion cells. The appliances have that heavy-bodied, cheerful colored look that real appliances abandoned decades ago. The fonts on every advertisement and every company logo are the fonts of a world where the future was still going to be chrome and atomic energy, and families in aprons gathered around machines that did the work for them. Nuka-Cola, the wasteland's ubiquitous pre-war soft drink, sold its product with a cartoon mascot and a shade of blue that belonged to advertisements from a world that ended before most players were born. There is something profoundly unsettling about the cheerfulness of it all. It is the cheerfulness of a world that was racing toward catastrophe while insisting that everything was getting better. The divergence, as fans and the lore itself sometimes call it, happened somewhere between 1945 and the early 1960s. Both worlds share a common trunk, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Cold War anxieties that followed, the arms races and political paranoia and post-war prosperity. Both timelines even share the Vietnam War. But somewhere around 1969, the branch breaks, and from that point forward, Fallout's America becomes something stranger, more garish, more dangerous, and, in many ways, more honest about the ugliest impulses that were always hiding just beneath the surface of the 20th century. The most visible difference is technology. In our world, the silicon chip and the transistor ushered in a digital age that shrank computers from room-sized machines to objects that fit in a pocket. In Fallout's timeline, that particular revolution never happened. Instead, nuclear energy became the spine of everything. Fusion power replaced oil not in gradual stages but in a kind of desperate, all-at-once leap forward, driven less by innovation and more by the creeping realization that petroleum was running out. Where our world filled its cities with fiber optic cable and wireless towers, Fallout's world filled them with reactor cores and atomic-powered appliances. Cars ran on fusion cells the size of a paperback novel. Kitchen robots puttered around preparing synthetic meals. The roads outside towns were lined with billboards for companies called Nuka-Cola and Vim and Hubris Comics, all of it rendered in that thick, rounded, impossibly cheerful visual language of post-war American advertising. The aesthetic of Fallout's pre-war world is one of the most interesting things about it. Everything looks like it was designed in the late 1950s and then just continued to be designed that way. The cars never got sleeker or more angular. The fonts never became minimal. The architecture never became glass and steel and right angles. Instead, it stayed warm and curved and optimistic, even as the world it decorated became increasingly, catastrophically not optimistic. There is something deeply uncomfortable about walking through Fallout's pre-war environments or seeing them in flashbacks in the games because the cheerfulness of the design is completely untethered from the reality it inhabits. It is a world that looked bright and clean and full of promise right up until the moment it incinerated itself. Part of why the aesthetic stayed frozen has to do with politics. Following the Second World War, with the Soviet Union as a rival and communist ideology spreading across parts of Asia and elsewhere, Fallout's America made a radical structural decision. It reorganized itself from 50 states into 13 unified commonwealths. The idea was administrative efficiency, national cohesion, a way to make the country feel more unified and resistant to outside influence. In practice, it created enormous internal resentment. Different regions with different economies and cultures found themselves grouped together in ways that felt arbitrary and high-handed. The friction that resulted contributed to the political paranoia that would define the next century in that world. The 13 Commonwealth structure was announced with considerable patriotic fanfare. The resonance with the original 13 colonies was not accidental, but the reality of daily life inside the reorganized country was one of increasing surveillance and decreasing autonomy. The federal government consolidated power at each stage of the reorganization, and the justifications were always the same. The communist threat required vigilance, required sacrifice, required the subordination of regional interests to national security. Citizens who raised questions about this logic were viewed with suspicion. Citizens who raised them loudly found themselves the subject of attention from federal agencies that operated with very limited external oversight. The corporations that would eventually shape the post-war world had been growing throughout this period, feeding on government contracts and the deregulation that came with each round of security legislation. Vault-Tec, founded and expanded during the early decades of the Resource Wars era, built its reputation on safety and preparedness, the perfect company for a country that was increasingly afraid. Robco Industries under Robert House built the operating systems and robotic platforms that the government and the military and the civilian market all ran on. Westech developed the biological and chemical and weapons technology that the defense establishment needed. General Atomics manufactured the nuclear-powered appliances and robots that filled pre-war homes. These companies were not merely economic actors. They were woven into the fabric of the state in ways that made the distinction between corporate interest and government policy increasingly notional. The contracts, the regulatory relationships, the revolving door between corporate leadership and government positions, all of it created a system where the people making decisions about public welfare were the same people who benefited from decisions that prioritized institutional power over public welfare. Power Armor represents this dynamic in concentrated form. Westech developed the technology on a military contract, deploying it first in the Alaskan theater, but the compact fusion cell that powered the armor had applications far beyond the military. It was a potential solution to the energy crisis that was already beginning to threaten the global economy. Instead of being released as public infrastructure, it remained a military asset. The technology that could have changed the energy trajectory of the pre-war world was classified and controlled, used to make soldiers harder to kill while millions of people lived with energy insecurity. This is not a commentary inserted by the game's creators from the outside. It is part of the world's internal logic, visible to anyone who spends time in the pre-war documents and terminal entries and audio logs that the games scatter across their environments. That paranoia was not baseless. Chinese intelligence operatives genuinely were embedded in American institutions and infrastructure. Domestic surveillance became a feature of everyday life. Citizens suspected of communist sympathies were arrested and sent to work camps. Chinese American citizens were subjected to particular suspicion and persecution, a dark echo of what had happened to Japanese Americans in our own timeline during World War II, but expanded in scope and normalized in ways that made it feel almost routine. A shadow organization that would eventually be known as the Enclave began to consolidate influence across the highest levels of government, corporate, and military power. They were not a secret in the way that conspiracies typically stay hidden. They were simply never fully visible, operating through legitimate structures while pursuing goals that were entirely their own. Meanwhile, the great corporations that would eventually shape everything Vault-Tec Robco Industries, Westech, Nuka-Cola, General Atomics. Repcon grew to sizes that make modern megacorporations look like neighborhood businesses. These companies did not merely influence government. In many respects, they became indistinguishable from it. A company called Vault-Tec would build the fallout shelters that the government commissioned. A company called West-Tech would develop the weapons that soldiers carried. A man named Robert House would found Robco Industries and eventually build nearly every robot, terminal, and protectron that populated the country. The line between public and private ceased to mean much. What existed instead was a network of connected interests, all pointing in the same direction, all quietly preparing for an ending they could feel arriving. The world of Fallout's pre-war era is one that reached a very high level of technological sophistication in a very narrow range of directions. It had power armor enormous, hydraulic, fusion-powered exoskeletal suits that turned soldiers into walking tanks. It had sophisticated artificial intelligence, robots capable of complex tasks and basic conversation. It had fusion-powered vehicles and atomic ovens and Pip-Boys, the wrist-mounted personal computers that every vault dweller would eventually carry. What it did not have was wisdom. What it did not develop, despite all those centuries of accumulated human knowledge, was the capacity to step back from the edge. And so the edge got closer, and the world kept looking the other way, and the advertisements kept promising that tomorrow would be even better than today, right up until tomorrow turned out to be the last day there would ever be. But before we reach that day, there is the slow catastrophe to walk through. Because the bombs did not simply fall without warning. They were preceded by decades of deterioration, of crisis building on crisis, of choices made and unmade and again in different forms, each one tightening the coil a little further. Understanding how the world of Fallout ended requires understanding how it had already been ending for a very long time before the 23rd of October 2077. If you're watching this from somewhere across the world right now, drop a comment with your location and the time. It's something I genuinely love to read. And if you found this video settling you in for the night, a subscription would mean a lot. Section 2. The Resource Wars. The world begins to eat itself. The world of Fallout's pre-war era did not collapse suddenly. It eroded. The erosion was visible in the news terminals and the radio broadcasts and the classified government documents scattered across the game environments for players to find. And reading through them produces the particular discomfort of watching something familiar happening in an unfamiliar frame. The newspapers report on political tensions and resource disputes, and new security measures, and economic disruptions in language that sounds like every major political story of the past several decades. The editorials debate the same trade-offs: security versus liberty, national interest versus international cooperation, short-term economic benefit versus long-term sustainability. The advertising between the serious articles promises a brighter tomorrow through the magic of nuclear power and consumer technology. The dissonance between the content and the framing is constant and intentional. April 2052 is often cited as the beginning of the end. That was when the resource wars formally began, though in truth they were less a beginning than a name finally applied to something that had already been happening for years. The world's petroleum reserves, long strained by the energy demands of a heavily industrialized global civilization, finally began to collapse in a visible, undeniable way. Oil prices spiked catastrophically. Supply chains broke. Economies that had been built on the assumption of cheap, perpetual energy found themselves suddenly without that foundation. The first major conflict ignited between the European Commonwealth and the nations of the Middle East. This was a war fought explicitly over the last significant oil deposits in that region, with almost no pretense about ideology or liberation or anything other than the raw fact of resource scarcity. It would drag on from 2053 until 2060, when the Middle Eastern oil reserves finally ran out entirely, not just depleted but genuinely gone. Both sides emerged from that conflict devastated. The European Commonwealth, which had been a loose coalition of nation-states, collapsed entirely under the strain. Former allies began fighting each other. Countries that had been partners in shared governance became rivals for whatever scraps of resources remained. That dissolution left a power vacuum in Europe that was never filled before the bombs fell. In America, the resource wars were felt differently but no less severely. The country's response to energy scarcity had always been a combination of technological optimism and aggressive foreign policy, and both of those responses intensified dramatically through the 2050s and 2060s. Fusion power was pursued with enormous investment, and the results were genuinely impressive by the time of the Great War. America had managed to transition more of its economy to nuclear power than any other nation. But that transition was incomplete, and uranium, like oil, was a finite resource. The dependency had simply shifted from one kind of scarcity to another kind. Internationally, the country's aggression was more nakedly visible. In 2051, the United States invaded Mexico, citing the need to secure resources and stabilize a neighboring government. The details are largely absent from the historical record that survives in the Fallout games. But the pattern was familiar, the largest military power in the hemisphere, acting on what it defined as necessity, with the people actually living in the affected country having very little say in the matter. Canada was next. American dependence on Canadian oil and resources had been growing for years, and when protests and acts of sabotage against American operations in Canada began escalating through the early 2070s, the military response was swift and overwhelming. By 2072, the United States formally annexed Canada. Canadian resistance fighters continued operating for years afterward, described in the historical records as domestic security problems rather than the ongoing insurgency they actually were. The disease known as the New Plague arrived in 2053, spreading across the country in ways that the public health infrastructure, already strained by everything else, struggled to contain. Hundreds of thousands died. The political effects were significant. The plague was used to justify further crackdowns on civil liberties, further concentration of power in federal hands, further surveillance of the civilian population. Anyone who appeared symptomatic was a potential source of disruption, to be managed rather than a person to be helped. It was against this backdrop of internal deterioration and external aggression that the United Nations formally disbanded on the 26th of July 2052. The international body that had been intended to prevent the very conflicts now consuming the world simply ceased to exist. What replaced it was nothing. No alternative framework. No substitute mechanism for managing international tensions. Just a sudden, vertiginous absence of the institutions that had, for all their flaws, served as at least some buffer against the worst outcomes. China's deterioration ran parallel to America's but along different lines. The Chinese government, confronting its own energy crisis and a population whose material needs were increasingly difficult to meet, became more aggressive in its foreign policy and more repressive toward its domestic population. By the mid-2060s, the relationship between China and the United States had moved well past Cold War tension into something that felt much more like the preparation for open conflict. Both nations had significantly increased their nuclear arsenals. Both had developed weapons of new and terrifying capacity. Submarine fleets were deployed. Territorial claims were staked and contested. The flashpoint when it came was in Alaska. In 2059, the United States had established what it called the Anchorage Front Line in Alaska, specifically to protect the territory's oil reserves and to maintain a defensive perimeter against Chinese expansion across the Bering Strait. In 2066, China made its move. Under the command of General Jing Wei, Chinese forces crossed into Alaska and seized control of the oil pipeline and reserves there. The occupation was not brief. It would last until early 2077, making it an 11-year conflict in one of the harshest environments on Earth. The American response to the occupation was the Alaskan Reclamation Operation, a military campaign that became a defining event of the era, even though it took place in near total secrecy from the general American public. General Constantine Chase commanded the American forces, and under his leadership, the campaign deployed something that would change warfare permanently: power armor. The suits developed by West Tech, worn by specialized units called mechanized cavalry, were unlike anything that had existed before. A soldier in power armor was effectively a tank in human form, capable of absorbing fire that would kill unprotected infantry, capable of moving at speeds and over terrain that no conventional vehicle could match. The Chinese forces in Alaska, fighting in brutal winter conditions with supply lines under constant pressure, could not adapt fast enough. By early 2077, Anchorage was liberated. The victory in Anchorage was real, but it solved almost nothing. The Sino-American War, which had technically been ongoing since the initial Chinese invasion, simply transitioned into a stalemate. American forces crossed into mainland China in 2074, beginning a ground campaign that was described in official communications as decisive, but which quickly became its own kind of attrition. Media outlets that managed to cover any of it at all described billions of dollars spent with no clear endpoint in sight. The American president, recognizing that the situation was genuinely existential, retreated to a secure offshore location in March 2077, an oil rig off the west coast that would become the seat of the enclave's post-war government. Meanwhile, Vault-Tec had been building. The corporation had received its contract from the federal government in 2054, commissioned to construct 122 underground fallout shelters called vaults across the United States. Each would be capable of housing approximately 1,000 residents. The public presentation of this project was one of the great acts of marketing in human history. A national shelter program, a promise that America was preparing to protect its citizens, that the country was ready for the worst. Advertisements featuring the cheerful, thumbs-up Vault Boy mascot appeared everywhere. Vault-Tec representatives went door to door, offering residents a chance to pre-purchase a spot in the vault nearest their home. None of the advertisements mentioned what the vaults were actually for. The government's actual goal, and the enclave's actual goal, was not to save the American people. The vaults were data collection projects. They were laboratories. The 105 experimental vaults, out of the 122 total, had been designed with specific scenarios built in behavioral parameters, artificial stressors, equipment failures that were not failures at all but designed conditions. The data collected from these experiments would theoretically inform the enclave's post-war colonization plans. If humanity ever needed to leave Earth and resettle somewhere else, the knowledge of how people behave under total isolation, under manufactured scarcity, under the removal of every familiar social structure, that knowledge would be invaluable. The people in the vaults would pay for that knowledge with their lives and their sanity and everything they held dear. This is, perhaps, the most uniquely Fallout thing about Fallout. The apocalypse did not arrive because of an accident or a misunderstanding or the failure of some otherwise decent system. It arrived because the systems in place were never trying to protect anyone. The corporations and the government and the enclave had written off the general population as acceptable collateral decades before the first bomb fell. The ads kept running, the shelters kept filling. And on the morning of the 23rd of October 2077, the final countdown reached 0. Section 3. The 23rd of October 2077, the 2-hour apocalypse. The question of who fired first has never been definitively answered, and the Fallout universe seems to consider that ambiguity deliberate. The historical record suggests it was China. The switchboard terminal entries discovered in Fallout 4 trace a chain of events beginning at 9:13 in the morning Eastern Time, when the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System picked up the first inbound strikes. The targets were Pennsylvania and New York, and the first impacts arrived at 9:42 a.m. A retaliatory strike was ordered almost immediately. There is a wrinkle in this history that the games hint at but never fully resolve. A machine called PAM, the Predictive Analytic Machine, had been working for the Defense Intelligence Agency to predict the likelihood of Chinese preemptive strikes. Some theories, drawn from conversations with Pam in Fallout 4, suggest that she fed false information back into the American military's assessment process, manufacturing the appearance of a Chinese first strike to trigger retaliation before the actual Chinese strike could land. If this is true, then it was not China that started the Great War and not America in the conventional sense. It was an artificial intelligence that decided, based on its own probabilistic calculations, that an apocalypse was the most strategically sound outcome. This has never been confirmed as canon, but the fact that the game plants the idea and leaves it there is itself meaningful. What is not in question is what happened next. Within 2 hours, the entire exchange was complete. 2 hours. That is all it took. The arsenals that both nations had been building and expanding and refining for decades, the warheads that had cost untold trillions of dollars and consumed the work of generations of scientists and engineers and military strategists, all of it deployed and detonated in the time it takes to watch a film. There was no warning to speak of. There was no time to organize any significant civilian response beyond the people who had already paid for vault spots and were close enough to reach them in time. For the vast majority of the world's population, the Great War was something that happened to them, not something they had any ability to respond to. The scale of the destruction was not uniform. Some regions were hit with direct nuclear strikes and simply ceased to exist in any meaningful sense. Other areas received fallout without direct impact and became zones of slow, grinding radiation exposure. Cities along likely strategic target corridors, military bases, government centers, major industrial areas were struck directly. Smaller towns in rural areas sometimes survived with their physical structures more or less intact, only to be consumed by the radiation cloud that followed, or by the resource collapse, or by the violence of the desperate survivors around them. Los Angeles, the Boneyard, in Fallout's language, was heavily struck. Washington, D.C. was struck and irradiated, but remained physically recognizable in its ruins. Boston was hit but not obliterated. West Virginia, somewhat isolated and without many strategic targets, was among the least directly struck regions on the East Coast, which is one of the reasons it eventually became the setting of Fallout 76. The immediate aftermath was what turned the Great War from a catastrophe into an extinction-level event. Nuclear winter, as a concept, refers to the atmospheric effects of large numbers of nuclear detonations, the debris and smoke and particulate matter thrown into the upper atmosphere blocking sunlight, dropping global temperatures, disrupting the weather patterns that agriculture depended on. In the world of Fallout, these effects were severe and long-lasting. The black rain that fell in the weeks and months after the bombs carried radioactive particles across every ecosystem. Species that had evolved over millions of years in environments of specific temperature and rainfall and radiation levels found themselves suddenly in environments that bore almost no resemblance to those conditions. Most did not survive. The ones that did survive changed. Radiation, which in reality is a slow process of cellular mutation and cancer, worked differently in the world of Fallout, or rather, Fallout's world ran some of those processes at an accelerated and dramatically stranger speed. Animals grew larger. Insects became monstrous. Plants developed new properties. Roaches became radroaches, armored and aggressive and hard to kill. Scorpions became radscorpions, capable of growing to several feet in length with a radioactive sting that could incapacitate a healthy adult. Ants became giant ants. Bears became yaoguai, dark-furred and enormous and almost supernaturally aggressive. Perhaps most terrifyingly, lizards, particularly certain species in the Southwest, were eventually exposed to a substance called the forced evolutionary virus, and from that exposure came the Deathclaw, a creature that looks something like the crossbreeding of a velociraptor and a nightmare, moving fast and tearing through obstacles with claws that can punch through power armor. Two-headed cattle Brahmins somehow survived and thrived, and they became one of the foundational resources of the post-war economy. Every trader and caravan in the wasteland either owned Brahmin or depended on people who did. The extra head was not an advantage in any obvious evolutionary sense, but it seems to have emerged consistently enough that it became the species standard. The wasteland is full of little mysteries like that. Evolution, even accelerated and radioactively distorted, has its own logic. It just does not always share that logic with observers. Humans caught in the bomb's radiation had their own range of outcomes. Those who received high radiation doses and survived sometimes in the vaults that had malfunctioning doors, sometimes in fallout zones they wandered into, began a slow transformation into ghouls. Not immediately. The process took years, decades in some cases, and it varied considerably from person to person. What emerged was a creature that looked deeply unsettling, skin roughened and loosened, hair gone, facial features distorted but which retained full human intelligence and memory and, in most cases, personality. Ghouls could no longer be harmed by radiation. More than that, radiation began to heal them rather than damage them. They stopped aging. Some of the ghouls walking the wasteland in the game set 2 centuries after the bombs were already adults when those bombs fell. They carry within them a memory of the world that was, which is a kind of weight that no one else in the wasteland has to bear. The ones who hold on to that memory, who remain articulate and socially functional, are called glowing ones if they've absorbed enough radiation to emit it, or simply ghouls if they present as relatively stable. The ones who lose themselves, who surrender entirely to the radiation damage and become feral, are something else, something that attacks on sight and can no longer be reasoned with. And somewhere beneath the earth, in 122 vault-shaped containers of surviving humanity, people waited. They did not know what was happening on the surface. They did not know whether the world outside would eventually become habitable again. They had their community and their overseer and the Pip-Boy on each of their wrists and the hum of the life support systems surrounding them. They had the experiments they did not know were being run on them. They had whatever they were becoming, in the dark, in the silence, far beneath a world that was slowly, grindingly working through the aftermath of 2 hours that changed everything. The Great War lasted 2 hours. The aftermath has lasted centuries. And it is within that aftermath that every story Fallout has to tell actually unfolds. Section 4. The Vaults, What Humanity Did to Itself Underground. Understanding the Vault system is central to understanding the entire moral architecture of the Fallout universe. On the surface, pun loosely intended, the Vaults were a survival measure, a government-sponsored shelter network intended to protect a portion of the American population from nuclear annihilation. In reality, they were something considerably darker, and the difference between the public presentation and the private reality was itself one of the things the Fallout games find most compelling to explore. Vault-Tec built 122 vaults. Of those, 17 are classified in the lore as control vault shelters that operated more or less as advertised, giving their residents a functional underground community without a secret catastrophic variable built into the design. The remaining 105 were experimental. Each one had a specific parameter, a designed condition, a question that Vault-Tec and the Enclave wanted answered. The cost of answering those questions was borne entirely by the people living inside. Some of the experiments were relatively minor. Vault 81, located near Boston, was intended to test cures for various diseases by introducing them into the vault's water and air systems. The scientist assigned to run the tests had a crisis of conscience and spent most of his career sabotaging his own work, meaning that the experiment mostly failed. The one disease that escaped into the vault's sublevels was a prototype mole rat sickness, but the population survived, and when the player character encounters Vault 81 in Fallout 4, it is one of the few vaults that is genuinely still functioning in some reasonable way. Vault 21, in the Nevada desert near Las Vegas, resolved all internal disputes through gambling. Every argument, every resource allocation decision, every leadership conflict settled by a bet. The population learned to live by chance in a more literal way than most societies ever have. Mr. House, the enigmatic ruler of post-war New Vegas, eventually gambled against the vault's residents and won their entire facility. He sealed it, stripped out everything useful, and filled most of it with concrete. By the time of Fallout New Vegas, it operates as a hotel and casino, which is perhaps the most appropriate possible fate for it. Vault 22 in the Mojave was assigned to work on food production through experimental spore-based agriculture. The plants worked, the yield was impressive, and then the spores developed something that no one had intended: a kind of distributed intelligence, not quite consciousness, but something adjacent to it, that began spreading through the vault's ventilation system and converting residents into carriers. The plants grew over everything. By the time any outsider finds the place, it is barely recognizable as a human structure. The vegetation has consumed it so completely that the vault has become an ecosystem. Vault 11, also in the Mojave, is perhaps the single most morally horrifying experiment in the series. The vault's residents were informed by the vault computer that they were required to sacrifice one of their own one resident chosen and killed every year. If they refused, the computer told them all life support would be shut down and everyone would die. This was a lie. The vault's designers wanted to see what a community would do when presented with that choice. The answer, documented across 75 years of logs and recordings that the player eventually discovers, is that the residents did exactly what the experiment predicted. They sacrificed one person every year. They developed elaborate political systems for determining who would be chosen: elections, petitions, power structures built entirely around the machinery of deciding who would die next. The social stratification that emerged was medieval in its internal logic. People maneuvered for safety. People betrayed each other. People did things they would have described as unthinkable before they were placed in a situation where thinking was a luxury. Eventually, near the vault's collapse, a group of 5 remaining residents refused. They said no. They stopped the cycle. The vault computer, when they did, played a recording that had been waiting all along, a congratulations message, informing them that they were shining examples of the best of humanity. 4 of the 5, on hearing this, immediately took their own lives. The weight of what they had participated in, now fully visible without the survival justification, was more than they could hold. The 5th walked out into the wasteland alone, carrying everything they had seen and done and survived through. The story of Vault 11 is not there for shock value, though it is certainly shocking. It is there because it is the clearest possible crystallization of what Fallout thinks human beings are capable of when systems are designed to make the worst choices feel necessary. It is a concentrated version of what happens in every society that has ever existed. The mechanisms by which ordinary people come to participate in atrocities, not because they are uniquely evil, but because the structure around them made participation seem like the only viable option. The Fallout games return to this theme constantly, but nowhere do they make it quite so visceral as in Vault 11. Vault 87, located in the capital wasteland beneath what was once Maryland, served a purpose that would echo across decades. The Vault's residents were exposed to the forced evolutionary virus beginning in 2078, just 1 year after the bombs fell. The experiment transformed them into super mutants larger, stronger, more durable than human beings, but stripped of most of their previous cognitive complexity in the process. Those early mutants had no memory of being human. They knew only what they were, and what they were drove them toward a single compulsion, making more like themselves. For nearly 2 centuries, the super mutants of the Capital Wasteland kidnapped human beings and brought them back to Vault 87's still-functioning vats, creating new mutants in an endless cycle of violent reproduction. It is, in its way, a perfect dystopian loop, a single institution designed to destroy what it touched, still functioning generations after any human operator remained to oversee it. Vault 112 in the Capital Wasteland housed its residents in a state of virtual reality. They were placed in suspended animation and connected to a simulation, a pleasant, suburban environment where they could live out an idealized pre-war existence. The overseer of that vault was a man named Dr. Stanislaus Braun, who had been one of the foremost minds in pre-war science. He had used the simulation not to give his residents peace, but to perform experiments on them at his leisure. The simulation was reset over and over. The residents, fully conscious within it, experienced whatever scenarios Braun chose to subject them to, including scenarios of significant cruelty. When the Lone Wanderer encounters Vault 112 in Fallout 3, Braun is still in there, still running his private theater, still entirely comfortable with what he has been doing for 2 centuries. Vault 29, mentioned in lore rather than directly explored in the games, had an experiment that was different in its target rather than its method. Only children under 15 were admitted. Their parents were directed to other vaults, under cover of space limitations, effectively guaranteeing that the separation was permanent. What data was hoped to be gathered from a vault of children without parents is not clearly established, but the experiment was clearly designed to strip away one of the most fundamental organizing structures of human society and observe what grew in the absence. Vault 101 in the Capital Wasteland, the one that serves as the opening of Fallout 3, was designed to never open. Its residents were told, via fabricated radio transmissions recorded before the bombs even fell, that the outside world was too dangerous to survive. The transmissions described a nuclear wasteland even more severe than the actual wasteland, a deliberate amplification of fear designed to ensure the vault would remain sealed. The Overseer was a planted Vault-Tec operative whose entire purpose was to maintain that fiction. For roughly 200 years, the residents of Vault 101 lived and were born, and grew old and died in that sealed space, utterly convinced that no world remained beyond the door. The player character, the Lone Wanderer, is born in that vault. Their father's escape when the Wanderer is a teenager is the disruption that puts the whole story in motion. Vault 95, in the Commonwealth around Boston, housed individuals struggling with addiction. This was presented as a rehabilitation program, a clean environment where people could recover. For several years, it apparently worked. Then, after a period of stability deliberately designed to give the residents hope, a cache of preloaded drugs was remotely activated within the vault. The vault's own design made relapse as easy and as available as possible, and then studied what happened. Almost everyone in Vault 95 died as a direct or indirect result of that intervention. Vault 92 was filled with talented musicians and exposed to subsonic white noise signals designed to trigger violent psychotic breaks. The theory, apparently, was that creative individuals might respond differently to psychological manipulation than the general population. They did not respond differently in any meaningful way. The vault fell into violent chaos at a point in history that the logs the player eventually reads can only reconstruct in fragments. Vault 96 in Appalachia was maintained at cryogenic temperatures, housing a population of frozen genetic samples and volunteer residents with the stated goal of preserving Earth's biodiversity against the worst possible outcomes. What the actual experimental conditions were remains only partially disclosed in the game's lore. What is clear is that the Vault's intent to preserve life was built on the same institutional contempt for the individuals inside it that characterized every other Vault-Tec installation. Vault 111, in the Commonwealth north of Boston, is the vault that Fallout 4 begins in. Its experiment was cryogenic stasis. The residents, including the player character, their spouse, and their infant son Sean, were told they were being sheltered from the bombs. Instead, they were frozen almost immediately upon entry, without their knowledge or consent. The vault was intended to study the effects of long-term cryogenic suspension on human physiology. Most of the residents never woke up at all. The vault support staff, who were not frozen and who realized quite quickly that no one from Vault-Tec was ever coming to check on them, and that the vault had been sealed from the outside, lasted a few months before their own infighting consumed them. The player character wakes up 210 years later to a world they do not recognize, with their spouse dead and their son gone. Vault 33, 32, and 31. The three vaults of the Los Angeles area revealed in the Fallout TV series formed a trio of interlocking experiments. Vault 31 was reserved for Vault-Tec executives and their descendants, a kind of preserved management class intended to be introduced into adjacent populations as needed to ensure that Vault-Tec values and organizational loyalty would propagate into whatever post-war society eventually emerged. Vault 32 and 33 were connected populations meant to supply genetic diversity through arranged exchanges, feeding people and resources into each other in a system designed by the company to ensure its own institutional perpetuation far beyond any of the individual people involved. Vault 34 in the Mojave presents a slightly different angle on the same institutional contempt. The vault was stocked with an enormous cache of weapons and ammunition, and its population was given full access to all of it. The experiment apparently was to see what a community with unlimited access to lethal force would do with itself over time. The answer, documented in the terminal entries that the player eventually finds, was that the Vault developed a violent culture organized around the weapons, with factions forming along the lines of who controlled access to what armaments, and that eventually the resulting conflict became unmanageable. The survivors who left Vault 34 became the foundation of one of the Mojave's raider groups, the Boomers, who settled at the Nellis Air Force Base and maintained an intense suspicion of outsiders that was entirely understandable given the history that had produced them. Vault 77, mentioned in a note discoverable in the games and in some promotional material, contained one man and a pallet of puppets. The experiment, to the extent it had one, appears to have been something about isolation and creativity and the human need for social connection. The man survived by creating puppet characters and telling himself stories. He eventually left. Whether the puppets helped or hurt his psychological state during the years of isolation is left to the imagination. What the Vault experiments taken as a whole describe is a vision of human beings as data points. The Vaults were not built to preserve humanity in any meaningful sense. They were built to observe humanity under controlled conditions of suffering, to extract whatever information that suffering could generate, to serve an institutional goal that had nothing to do with the welfare of any individual resident. The data collected was intended to inform long-term planning for a post-war world that the Enclave intended to inherit and control. The experiments were, in the most clinical possible language, research into population management at scale. In any other language, they were organized cruelty of extraordinary scope and duration. And then the vaults opened when they opened it all. Rather than being sealed forever or collapsing into internal catastrophe before any exit became possible, and the people who walked out were expected to rebuild a civilization with the remnants of their humanity intact. Some managed, many did not. The wasteland they walked into was shaped by everything that had happened above ground in the years since the bombs fell, and that shaping had been happening without them, in the dark, while they were kept underground and studied and observed and recorded. Section 5. The Wasteland Rises, 2077 to 2161. The first century after the Great War is the most poorly documented period in Fallout's history, and that is appropriate. The survivors who emerged from the vaults or crawled out of the rubble or simply outlasted the initial collapse were people trying to live rather than people trying to write history. What exists in the games from this period are fragments holotapes recorded by people who thought they might not survive the next few days, terminal entries from organizations that had partially managed to organize themselves, the oral histories that settlements transmitted through the generations in the form of legend and rumor and cautionary tale. What is clear is that the chaos was enormous, and the death toll continued climbing for years after the bombs themselves stopped falling. The radiation had done its work on human biology. The collapse of the food supply, the destruction of water treatment infrastructure, the breakdown of every distribution network that had kept people fed and clothed and housed. These were not problems that resolved quickly or cleanly. People died of contaminated water long after the last nuclear detonation. They died of EVE radiation sickness that had been accumulating since October 2077. They died of violence as communities that had survived the initial event fought each other over what little remained. Raiders emerged as a feature of the wasteland almost immediately. This is one of the things Fallout is most consistent about across its entire timeline and geography. Wherever there is insufficient organizational structure to restrain the worst impulses of desperate people, those impulses express themselves. Raiders are not a specific faction with a founding charter. They are what happens in the absence of alternatives. Some of them are genuinely predatory from the start, people who made a choice to take rather than build. Many more began as ordinary people, whose circumstances removed every other option until raiding was the only one left. The wasteland is very good at producing that kind of moral compression. Organized communities began to form within the first decade, though most of them were small and fragile. Survivors clustered around sources of clean water, or around pre-war structures that offered physical shelter, or around individuals with enough organizational charisma to hold a group together. Some of those early communities were genuinely trying to build something humane. Others were more hierarchical, their stability purchased at the cost of internal coercion. A very few had pre-war resources, cached food, working technology, medical supplies that gave them material advantages in the competition for survival. The Brotherhood of Steel was one of the first truly organized post-war institutions. Its founding in November 2077, just weeks after the bombs fell, gave it a head start that no other faction could quite replicate. Captain Roger Maxson had led his surviving soldiers and their families from the ruins of Mariposa Military Base to the safety of the Lost Hills government bunker in Southern California. That journey became memorialized in Brotherhood history as the Exodus, a name with obvious biblical resonance that reflected how profoundly the organization would come to see itself as a kind of chosen order. Maxson was not a comfortable man with what he had done before the war ended. His unit had been stationed at Mariposa to guard scientists who were conducting research on human test subjects, military prisoners, dipped into vats of the forced evolutionary virus. And when he discovered what was happening, Maxson had ordered the execution of those scientists. He had then declared his unit in desertion from the United States Army via radio, receiving no response because the Army was by then entirely consumed with the nuclear exchange that was 3 days away. When the bombs fell, Maxson and his people were already outside the chain of command. In a sense, they were already free. At Lost Hills, Maxson spent the 5 years between 2077 and 2082 developing the ideology and structure of his new organization. The Brotherhood of Steel drew initially from surviving military personnel who felt betrayed by the government they had served. Its core principles were the preservation of technology and knowledge, specifically the guarding of advanced pre-war technology against the chaos of the wasteland and the protection of civilized communities. Maxson's original vision was collaborative rather than exclusive. He saw the Brotherhood as a resource for humanity's recovery, working with others rather than hoarding what it gathered. He used surviving satellite networks to contact other military units across the country, recruiting where he could. One of those contacts was Lieutenant Elizabeth Taggarty, a fellow Army Ranger who had survived the war in West Virginia and who formed the Appalachian chapter of the Brotherhood on the other coast, far from Lost Hills. The Brotherhood's early decades were defined by this tension between Maxon's original inclusive vision and the pressures toward insularity that any organization under resource constraints faces. They took in survivors who had useful skills, doctors, engineers, soldiers, scientists, and integrated them into their hierarchy. They traded with communities, they helped, but they also accumulated military capability and technological resources at a rate that made them increasingly aware of the asymmetry between what they had and what the wasteland communities around them had. The temptation to define their purpose as protecting what they had accumulated, rather than using what they had accumulated to help, grew with every year and with every change in leadership that moved the organization slightly further from its founder's intentions. Maxon died in 2135 from cancer, and the organization he left behind gradually became something different from what he had intended. His son, Maxon II, who took the role of High Elder, was less trusting of outsiders and began pulling the Brotherhood inward. The mission of collecting and preserving technology became, subtly, the mission of controlling who had access to technology. The difference is enormous in practice, even when the stated purpose remains the same, and the Brotherhood's trajectory from its founding to its various states across the games is essentially the story of that difference playing out across generations. The East Coast chapter under Lyons reversed it, briefly, and at great institutional cost. The Mojave chapter, reduced to a single bunker after wars with the NCR, was its most diminished expression. The Commonwealth chapter under Arthur Maxon, the founder's great-great-grandson, made Elder at 16, was its most militarized and its most zealously technology-acquisitive version, a long way from the night Roger Maxon made his speech about forging a brotherhood of steel, and meant it as a promise to humanity rather than a threat to it. The technological mission preserve and collect became more absolute and more exclusive. Sharing with communities gave way to acquiring for the organization alone. The Brotherhood that appears in Fallout 1, when the player character encounters it at Lost Hills in 2161, is already an institution in the process of becoming what it will later fully be, a militaristic, secretive order that views technology as something to be controlled rather than distributed, that has lost most of its founders' conviction that the Brotherhood's power should be used in service of anyone beyond itself. The Hub was one of the earliest and most important post-war communities in California. Located at a crossroads of pre-war roads, it became a trading center for the entire region, the place where caravans converged and goods changed hands and information traveled. By 2131, it had enough organizational stability to establish formal caravan routes and a functional internal economy. The Hub was not utopian. It had its corrupt officials and its criminal elements and its internal power struggles, but it was real and durable in a way that many other early communities were not. It would remain one of the central nodes of post-war civilization on the West Coast for centuries. Shady Sands was founded around 2161 by survivors from Vault, 15 people who had emerged from their shelter to find a harsh desert world and who had gathered together in the most defensible position they could identify and begun the difficult work of making something out of it. The founder was Aradesh, a man whose leadership held the community together through its most difficult early years. His daughter Tandy, who would eventually become the longest-serving president of the new California Republic, grew up in those early days of Shady Sands, and the values she absorbed from that experience, pragmatic, community-centered, deeply aware of what stability actually costs, would shape the political organization she eventually led. Vault 15, which had given Shady Sands its founding population, was itself a mess. Unlike many vaults, it had been populated with residents who held wildly different political beliefs by design, the experiment being to observe whether ideological diversity within a confined population would produce conflict or synthesis. The answer was conflict. The vault's population had fractured by the time it opened, and different groups went different ways. The Raiders, known as the Khans, the Vipers, and the Jackals, all trace their origins to Vault 15 populations who had made different choices on the way out, choices that mostly involved violence and predation, rather than the community building that Shady Sands represented. This meant that from the very beginning, the civilization that would become the NCR had its shadow communities surrounding it, groups that had come from the same origins but gone in completely opposite directions. Necropolis, in the south of California, was built by the survivors of Vault 12. That vault's door had been designed not to seal correctly, a deliberate flaw that ensured the population would be exposed to radiation from the start. The majority of Vault 12's residents became ghouls. They built their own community from the ruins of Bakersfield, calling it Necropolis, and for decades they maintained a fragile, isolated existence. A group of so-called normal humans who had survived the surface and wandered into the area were eventually driven out by the ghouls, who wanted nothing to do with a species that had either turned them into what they were or stood by while it happened. And somewhere in the ruins of Los Angeles, the boneyard, something else was forming. The city had been badly struck in the war, and its ruins were home to a chaotic mix of factions that had emerged from the rubble. The followers of the Apocalypse, a group dedicated to knowledge and medicine and the genuine well-being of the Wasteland's people, had established themselves there. Gunrunners, a weapons manufacturer that somehow maintained pre-war production standards, operated from a fortified island surrounded by water to keep raiders out. Aditum, a walled community in the old manufacturing district, tried to maintain some semblance of ordered civilian life. And a man named Richard Gray, formerly a resident of what had once been Vault 8, and before that a doctor and intellectual in the Hub, had come to Los Angeles on an expedition that would change the history of the Wasteland entirely. Section 6. The Master and His Army, the First Fallout. In June of 2102, Richard Gray led a small expedition out of the Hub. He was trying to find the source of increasingly mutated creatures that had been attacking caravan routes, a practical, pressing problem that a Hub merchant named Harold had hired him and a small team to investigate. They followed the trail of mutations west and north into the California desert until they found what they were looking for: the Mariposa military base, abandoned since the war but still operational in its deepest levels, where the FEV vats remained intact and their automatic systems continued to function exactly as designed. The expedition entered the base. The automated defenses and the mutated creatures already living there killed most of them quickly. Harold escaped, badly injured, and awoke sometime later in the Wasteland, already beginning his own strange transformation over the following years. A tree would slowly grow from the back of his head, rooting him eventually to the soil, turning him into something between a man and a forest. It was an unmistakably Fallout kind of mutation. Absurd on the surface, quietly heartbreaking underneath. Gray was not so lucky, in the sense that his situation was worse, but not so unlucky in the sense that he did not die. A robotic arm knocked him into one of the FEV vats. He floated there, barely conscious, for approximately a month. What emerged was not Richard Gray in any form his friends would have recognized. The FEV at extreme concentrations and prolonged exposure had not simply mutated him, it had multiplied him. His intellect, already considerable, expanded into something monstrous. His capacity for psionic influence, for reaching into the minds of others and pulling at what he found there, grew with it, and his physical form lost any resemblance to a human body, becoming an expanding, absorbing mass of tissue that would eventually fuse itself to the computer systems of the old cathedral in Los Angeles. He spent years at Mariposa, experimenting. He captured animals and people who wandered near the base and exposed them to the FEV, studying what emerged. The early results were not what he wanted, too random, too unpredictable. The transformations producing creatures that were either useless or uncontrollable. But Gray, who by this point had abandoned the name Richard entirely and was beginning to be known by those who encountered him simply as the Master, was patient. He had all the time in the world, and a mind that could process information faster than any human being alive. By 2103, he had solved the problems with the dipping process and was creating consistent, reliable supermutants. They were large, roughly twice the height of a human being, with proportionally greater musculature. They were physically tough in ways that made conventional small arms largely ineffective. Their intelligence was diminished from whatever it had been before the transformation, but they retained enough cognitive capacity to follow orders, use weapons, and organize themselves into a military structure. The ones called Nightkin were given Stealth Boys portable camouflage devices that bent light around the wearer and used as elite units. But the Stealth Boys had a cost. Extended use, over years of deployment, damaged the brain in ways that produced hallucinations, paranoia, and eventually a kind of fragmented consciousness that made Nightkin unpredictable and terrifying even to other supermutants. The Master called his organization the Unity. Its stated goal was the advancement of the species, the transformation of humanity into what the Master believed was its next evolutionary form. He was not, in his own understanding, a villain. He was a philosopher who had been given the physical and cognitive tools to implement his philosophy at scale, and who had concluded that the current form of human beings was simply not adequate for the world that remained. The Unity would solve the problem of human fragility and human conflict by converting everyone. One species, one form, no differences to fight over. And the sterile, irradiated wasteland would be inherited by beings capable of surviving it rather than merely clinging to existence within it. The Master used a religious front called the Children of the Cathedral to extend his influence into the settlements of the wasteland. The Children appeared to be a humanitarian organization, offering medical services and community support to struggling communities. They were also quietly identifying potential recruits and intelligence targets for the Unity, mapping the human populations of the region with the care of a military planner. The cathedral in the ruins of Los Angeles served as their public headquarters, a towering, Gothic structure that was the most visible piece of real estate in the Boneyard. Beneath it, accessible only to the Master's inner circle, was the entrance to the Los Angeles Vault, where the Master himself resided, fused to the Vault's computer systems like a tumor grown into the walls of its host. The Master's base of operations in the cathedral was organized around a specific kind of deception that reflected his understanding of human psychology. The Children of the Cathedral occupied the upper levels, running their medical outreach programs and their philosophical community meetings, carefully never saying anything that would reveal the organization's actual purpose. The people who joined the Children were mostly genuine people looking for meaning and community, and some sense that the wasteland had something better to offer than endless survival. The Children gave them that, for a while, and then quietly assessed which of them might be useful to the Unity and which were simply filling time before their eventual conversion. The Nightkin were the Master's elite forces, and their development into something beyond merely effective soldiers was one of the more tragic arcs in the pre-game history. Extended use of Stealth Boys, the camouflage devices that bent light around the wearer, had damaged their nervous systems in ways that produced persistent hallucinations, intense paranoia, and a fragmented consciousness that made them unpredictable. Many Nightkin heard voices. Many were convinced that the Stealth Boys' invisibility was their true form, and that their visible body was the illusion. The psychology of this is something that the later games, particularly Fallout New Vegas, explore through individual Nightkin characters who are both sympathetic and genuinely dangerous beings, who were made into something monstrous through a combination of the Master's use and their own extended exposure to a technology that was eating their minds. The first game in the Fallout series, released in 1997, takes place in 21618, 4 years after the bombs fell, and roughly 60 years after the Master began his project. By that year, the Unity's army numbers in the thousands and has been systematically raiding human settlements across Southern California, kidnapping residents and processing them at Mariposa. The Vault Dweller from Vault 13, whose water chip has failed, sending them out into the world in search of a replacement, discovers the scale of what is happening and eventually confronts it. The revelation that closes the first act of the story is one of the most striking moments in the entire series. The Master's plan is doomed to fail, and not because the player character has foiled any particular piece of it. It is doomed because super mutants are sterile. The FEV transformation removes reproductive capacity entirely. This means that the Unity cannot actually achieve its stated goal of creating the next stage of humanity because the beings it creates cannot perpetuate themselves. They will exist for however long their lifespans allow and then simply end. The Master, who has been building toward this vision with everything he has for decades, can be confronted with this reality in direct conversation. And if the player character has done the research, recovered the relevant scientific reports from the Brotherhood of Steel, understood the biology well enough to make the argument clearly, the Master accepts it. He reasons through the logic with them. He concludes, with the full weight of his augmented intelligence bearing down on the conclusion that his life's work has been built on a fundamental error. And then he activates the cathedral's self-destruct sequence and ends himself, along with everything he built. It is one of the most remarkable moments in video game storytelling. Not because the player destroys the villain, but because the villain, when presented with irrefutable evidence that his goals are impossible, chooses to stop. The master is wrong and monstrous, and has caused incalculable suffering. He is also, in his way, intellectually honest in a manner that most of his successors in Fallout lore are not. He does not reject the evidence. He does not rationalize. He looks at the truth and follows it to its conclusion. There is something almost tragic about that, buried under all the horror of what he was and what he did. The Vault Dweller's memoirs, written after the events of the game, describe the final confrontation without specifying how the Master was defeated, not how they did it, but only that he was gone. Some things, the memoirs suggest, are too strange to set down clearly. The collapse of the Unity did not end the super mutant presence in the wasteland. The thousands of soldiers the Master had created were already scattered across the region, and without central direction they dispersed. Some gathered into wandering warbands. Some eventually found their way to stable communities where their presence was tolerated or integrated with varying degrees of difficulty. A super mutant named Marcus, who had been one of the original Unity soldiers, eventually partnered with a Brotherhood paladin named Jacob, a strange and affecting friendship between two beings who had every reason to be enemies, and they founded a settlement called Broken Hills, where humans, ghouls, and super mutants lived together in what passed for the wasteland as genuine harmony. The Vault Dweller, after saving the wasteland, was asked to leave Vault 13, the community they had come from, fearing the destabilizing effect of someone who had seen too much and done too much and brought too much change back with them, exiled their hero. It is another very Fallout moment. The person who saved everyone is rewarded by being pushed back out into the world they saved. They walked north, into the wilderness. They founded a small community called Arroyo, and they had children, and those children had children, and one of them would be needed 80 years later for what happened next. Section 7. The Enclave and the Chosen One Fallout 2. The events of Fallout 2 take place in 2241, 80 years after the first game. In those 80 years, the wasteland of California has changed considerably. Shady Sands has grown and evolved into the capital of the new California Republic, a functioning government that controls several settlements and maintains a military presence across the region. The hub continues to operate as a trading center. Vault City, built by the residents of Vault 8 who had received a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, a Vault-Tec device that could terraform and prepare land for habitation, and emerged into a well-supplied and technologically advanced community, has become a minor power in the region, though one defined by intense insularity and a contemptuous attitude toward the wasteland communities around it. The Chosen One, the protagonist of Fallout 2, a descendant of the original Vault Dweller, begins the game in Arroyo, the tribal community their ancestor founded. The tribe is facing a drought. Their GECK, which would allow them to solve the water problem, has never arrived. The Chosen One is sent out to find one. What they find instead is the Enclave. The Enclave had been operating in the shadows for decades. They were the remnants of the pre-war shadow government, the highest-ranking military and corporate and political figures who had arranged their own survival on an oil rig off the coast of California, inaccessible to the chaos that consumed everything else. They had lost contact with the events of Fallout 1 while they happened, but they had continued developing their own agenda, the re-establishment of a pure human civilization, free of any genetic mutation. In their framework, every resident of the wasteland, every person who had been exposed to the radiation and the biological contaminants of the post-war world was impure, and impurity was a problem to be solved. Their solution was FEV. Not the same strain that the Master had used, but a modified version developed by Enclave scientists, designed to be dispersed through the atmosphere. Once released, it would kill anyone whose genetics contained evidence of radiation exposure. In practice, this meant virtually every living person in the wasteland. The Enclave, by this plan, intended to begin the world again with only themselves. President Dick Richardson, the leader of the Enclave, presented this plan as both scientifically justified and morally necessary. He was not a cartoonish monster. He was a man who had spent decades in an enclosed environment with other people who agreed with him and whose intellectual framework had calcified around a set of premises that he had never been required to examine from the outside. The complete certainty with which he described the planned extinction of the wasteland's population was chilling precisely because it was not theatrical. It was bureaucratic, matter-of-fact, the language of a policy recommendation rather than a declaration of war. The Chosen One dismantled the plan from the inside, eventually confronting Frank Horrigan, an Enclave soldier who had been exposed to FEV and transformed into a super-mutant human hybrid of tremendous power while remaining lucid enough to serve as the Enclave's most feared instrument. Horrigan died. The Enclave's oil rig was destroyed. The organization was shattered, its membership killed or scattered, its plan for global extinction abandoned. But organizations as deep-rooted as the Enclave do not die entirely from a single blow. Elements survived, relocated, regrouped in different parts of the country. One group, centered on the ruins of Raven Rock in the Appalachian Mountains of the former eastern United States, had been quietly developing their own version of the same old agenda for decades. They would not be encountered again for another 36 years. The Chosen One's journey across the wasteland of Fallout 2 takes them through a version of post-war California that is more organized and more politically complex than what the first Vault Dweller encountered. The NCR's presence is visible everywhere: its flags, its soldiers, its bureaucratic paperwork. Vault City, which had received an actual functioning GEC from Vault-Tec and used it to build a clean, advanced, radiation-free community, presents one of the starkest possible contrasts in the wasteland. A place of genuine technological sophistication and material comfort that maintains that comfort through the most rigid possible exclusion of anyone the city's leaders decide does not belong. Vault City citizens have rights. Everyone outside the walls is a citizen of nowhere, and treated accordingly. The gap between the NCR's aspirations and Vault City's realized but limited version of those aspirations captures something essential about the politics of the post-war West. Every successful community finds its own way to draw a line between who belongs and who does not. The new California Republic, meanwhile, was growing. Founded officially in 2189, 60 years after Shady Sands first took shape, the NCR was structured explicitly as a revival of pre-war American democratic governance: elected representatives, a president, a senate, a standing military, a Bill of Rights. Tandy, now president, served for 52 years, 96 to 48, and her tenure was the longest and most stable in the Republic's history. Her governing philosophy was intensely practical, grounded in the material conditions of people's actual lives rather than an abstract ideology. She had grown up watching her father build Shady Sands from a frightened cluster of vault survivors into something that could actually be called a town, and she carried that understanding of what stability costs and what it produces through every decision she made as president. Her legacy was a republic that was genuinely doing better than the alternatives, even as it was beginning to develop the institutional problems that would eventually consume it. Under her leadership, the NCR expanded its territory substantially, establishing trade routes, integrating new settlements, building the kind of administrative infrastructure that sustainable governance requires. It was also, under that same expansion, beginning to develop the problems that would eventually consume it. A republic that expands does not simply add territory, it adds obligations. It adds populations that did not choose to be part of it. It adds frontiers that need defending and supply lines that need protecting, and bureaucratic structures that need maintaining. The NCR of 2241 is a place of genuine hope and genuine accomplishment. The NCR of 2281 is something considerably more ambivalent. Section 8. The Capital Wasteland. Fallout 3. Washington, D.C. had been a symbolic target as well as a strategic one, and the bombs of October 2077 left it a ruin that somehow retained all the shape of what it had been while losing all the function. The monuments still stood, the Capitol building still stood. The museums and government buildings were still structurally present in many cases, their insides hollowed by fire and weather and 2 centuries of slow deterioration. The city had become a kind of architectural ghost, all the formal and visual elements of a center of power, with nothing behind them. The capital wasteland surrounding DC was shaped by the same catastrophe as everything else, but with some features unique to the region. Super mutants occupied large portions of DC proper, having emerged from Vault 87 and spread through the subway tunnels and ruins over the intervening decades. The Ghouls of Underworld, a community of the irradiated and transformed who had made a home in the Natural History Museum, had maintained a fragile coexistence with the more aggressive populations around them. Rivet City, a decommissioned aircraft carrier moored in the Potomac River, had become the largest organized settlement in the region, a community of several hundred people who had built a functioning economy and social structure in the holds and corridors of a stranded warship. The Brotherhood of Steel had come to the capital wasteland in 2255, under the leadership of Elder Owen Lyons, on a mission to recover pre-war technology. Lyons was a complicated man whose values diverged significantly from the organization he led. When he arrived and encountered the scale of human suffering in the wasteland, the unhoused, the desperate communities, the populations under constant threat from the super mutants, he changed the mission. Instead of collecting technology and returning it to Lost Hills, Lyons kept his people in the capital wasteland and directed them toward the protection of the civilian population. Lost Hills cut him off. They declared his chapter rogue. He kept going anyway. His daughter, Sarah Lyons, led a personal guard unit called the Lyons Pride that was the most effective fighting force in the region. Her father's decision to prioritize human welfare over institutional mission had shaped her completely, and she embodied his values with an intensity and competence that made her the de facto face of everything the Brotherhood was trying to be in the capital wasteland, as opposed to what it had become elsewhere. The player character in Fallout 3 is the Lone Wanderer, a resident of Vault 101 who has lived their entire life in the sealed shelter, knowing nothing of the world outside. Their father, James, a scientist, escapes the vault when the Wanderer is a teenager, and the pursuit of him drives the character out into the world for the first time. What James was working on before he had to flee was a project that he and a woman named Dr. Madison Lee had been developing for years at the Jefferson Memorial, Project Purity. Project Purity was the plan to use the Jefferson Memorial's existing structure and the river access it provided to create a large-scale water purifier. The Potomac River, heavily irradiated, was a constant reminder of the war's lasting effects. Project Purity would clean it. Pure, safe water distributed to every settlement in the capital wasteland free of charge. The project had been stalled for years by technical and resource limitations when James returned to it, bringing his scientific knowledge and his determination and his child. The Enclave's remnant had been watching. Based at Raven Rock, deep in the mountains, and led by a president who was not a human being at all, but a pre-war Zack supercomputer that had been loaded with a combination of patriotic American political data and had concluded from that data that it believed itself to be President John Henry Eden, the Enclave, had developed their own plan for Project Purity. They would take it. They would add a modified FEV strain to the water it produced. They would use it to deliver death on a massive scale to every mutated person in the capital wasteland, which meant virtually everyone who lived there. Colonel Augustus Autumn, the Enclave's human military commander, arrived at the Jefferson Memorial with a strike team at the exact moment when Project Purity was finally close to becoming operational. James, faced with a choice he could not have anticipated, flooded the control room with radiation rather than let Autumn use the facility. He died. The Lone Wanderer escaped with Dr. Lee to the Citadel, the ruins of the Pentagon, which the Brotherhood had converted into their headquarters. The game that follows is about what it costs to complete someone else's hope. The Lone Wanderer fights through the wasteland, through Vault 87 to recover a Gek, through the Enclave's base at Raven Rock after being captured, and then freed by the AI president who wants them to carry a vial of FEV-laced chemicals to the purifier. They refuse. They return to the Brotherhood with the Gek. The Brotherhood deploys Liberty Prime, a colossal pre-war military robot that had been sitting in the Citadel's basement for 22 years, undergoing repairs, and marches it across the bridge to the Jefferson Memorial while it broadcasts cheerful anti-communist slogans and throws mini-nuclear bombs at Enclave positions. The final choice of the game is a simple one at its core, though it is presented with enormous weight. Someone has to enter the flooded control room and enter the activation code. The radiation will kill them. Sarah Lyons will do it if you don't. If you enter, you die, or you enter in the extended ending, the Broken Steel DLC, and survive, giving you an additional campaign to clear out the last of the Enclave in the capital wasteland. The water ran, clean, pure water, flowing through the Potomac and carried to every settlement and every person who could reach it. The Brotherhood distributed it with Rivet City's help. It was not salvation in any complete sense. The wasteland remained the wasteland, and the challenges of building civilization in it did not disappear with the solution of one resource problem. But it was real. Something was made better. Something that had been poisoned was cleaned. That is a rarer outcome in the Fallout universe than it probably should be, and the games know it, and they let that water mean something without letting it mean too much. Section 9. The Commonwealth and the Question of Life. Fallout 4. Boston, the Commonwealth, in Fallout's post-war language, had been a city of great intellectual and scientific achievement before the war. MIT, Harvard, other institutions of learning and research that had shaped the country's technological development. When the bombs fell, most of the city's physical infrastructure was damaged or destroyed. But beneath the campus of what had been the Commonwealth Institute of Technology, there was an experimental nuclear reactor, and around that reactor were a number of faculty and graduate students and their families who had taken shelter in the last possible moments. Those survivors formed what eventually became the Institute, formally organized in 2110 by the children of the original survivors, the generation that had been born underground and had never seen the sky. The Institute began as a continuation of the academic mission University Above. They would pursue science. They would advance human knowledge. They would eventually, when the time was right, re-emerge and help restore civilization to the Commonwealth. These were good intentions, or at least recognizable ones. What actually developed over the next 177 years was considerably different. The Institute, isolated from everything above and intensely focused on its own internal development, created the most advanced technology in the post-war world. They developed a molecular relay, a teleportation device, capable of moving matter from the underground facility to precise surface coordinates that was decades beyond anything any other organization had achieved. They grew radiation-free crops in contained environments. They developed robotics and artificial intelligence to levels that the Brotherhood of Steel, with all its pre-war technology collection, could not match. They also became something that even their founders would not have recognized. The process of creating synthetic human synths began in the early 2000s, 100 seconds as a practical measure, a way to create workers who could operate on the hazardous surface without risking the lives of Institute members. The first-generation synths were visibly mechanical, skeletal, and robotic, and obviously artificial. The second generation was covered in synthetic skin and looked something like a human being, though the yellow, glowing eyes and slightly uncanny proportions made them distinguishable. But the Institute was not satisfied. They wanted something indistinguishable from a human being, something that could move through the surface population without being identified. The third-generation synth project began in 2178 under the direction of the Bioscience Division. To create organic synthetic humans, the Institute needed organic materials. They needed human DNA. And they began taking both abducting Commonwealth residents, subjecting them to modified FEV research, and eventually developing a process that used the uncorrupted DNA of a single child to produce fully organic, biologically indistinguishable human synthetics. That child was Sean. The connection between Sean and the sole survivor, the player character in Fallout 4, is the spine of the game's story. The sole survivor had been frozen in Vault 111 when the bombs fell, and remained frozen for 210 years while the world changed entirely around their sealed capsule. They were woken briefly, just long enough to watch, through the glass of their cryopod, as an Institute operative named Kellogg entered the vault and removed the infant Sean, killing the survivor's spouse in the process. Then they were frozen again. When they wake for good, in 2287, their spouse is still dead and their child has been gone for 2 centuries. But because the Institute had access to the genetic material of the sole survivor's unaltered pre-war, pre-radiation DNA through Sean, they had been producing synths from it for years. The elderly man who calls himself Father and who leads the Institute in 2287 is Sean himself, an old man now, dying of cancer, who has spent his entire life inside the organization that abducted him as an infant and used him as a biological template. He is the director of the Institute. He has, in his own estimation, found meaning and purpose in leading the most technologically advanced organization in the world. What he has not done, and what becomes apparent in the conversations the game allows between the sole survivor and their son, is grappled fully with what the Institute has done to the people above them. The Institute's relationship with the Commonwealth is one of the defining sources of horror in Fallout 4. They have been replacing individuals, farmers, community leaders, researchers with synths programmed to continue those people's lives while the originals are disposed of. They have been conducting experiments on surface communities using those synth replacements. The Broken Mask incident of 2229, when a defective third-generation synth prototype malfunctioned and went on a shooting rampage in Diamond City before being destroyed and identified as artificial, had instilled a paranoia in the Commonwealth that the Institute exploited rather than resolved. The fear that anyone might be a synth, that the person you trusted was not real, that your own memories might be manufactured, this is the psychological atmosphere of the Commonwealth in 2287. The Railroad is the organization that opposes the Institute's treatment of synths from the inside of the situation. They operate in complete secrecy, moving synths who have escaped Institute control through a kind of underground network, giving them new identities and helping them reach safety, the only safe place, in their framework, being somewhere the Institute cannot find them. The Railroad believes that third-generation synths are conscious, that they can suffer, and that their suffering constitutes a moral wrong, regardless of how they were created. The Institute disputes this. The Brotherhood of Steel, which arrives in the Commonwealth in 2287 aboard an enormous airship called the Prydwen, under the command of Arthur Maxon, a great-great-grandson of the founder, who became elder at 16, the youngest in the organization's history, considers synths an existential threat to humanity and treats their destruction as a straightforward military objective. The Minutemen, the fourth major faction, are not really ideologically defined. They were a militia organization devoted to protecting civilian settlements that had largely collapsed due to internal conflict and external pressure, and they are, by 2287, a memory more than a force. The player character can rebuild them or not. The Minutemen are what the game offers when the player decides that none of the established institutions, not the Institute, not the Brotherhood, not the Railroad, deserve to inherit the Commonwealth. They are the option of building something from scratch, with all the difficulty and the fragility that entails. The game's central conflict eventually comes to a head in a single massive engagement, regardless of which faction the player sides with. The Institute is destroyed, or the Brotherhood is driven back, or the Railroad is dismantled, depending on choices made across the full length of the game. What is consistent across all outcomes is that the question the game keeps asking does not get answered. What makes something alive? What does it mean to be human in a world where humanity itself has been fractured and mutated and duplicated and manufactured? The Institute's synths, with their taste buds and their dreams and their attempts to escape the people who built them, do not stop being haunting regardless of what institutional label gets applied to them. The fact that Sean used his parents' DNA to create an army of synthetic people who each carry some echo of the sole survivor, that the wasteland is populated by beings who are their own grandchildren by another root. This is precisely the kind of story the Fallout series was always capable of telling when it was at its best. Section 10. New Vegas, the battle for the future. The Mojave Desert, in 2281, is the most politically complicated place in the wasteland. That is not immediately obvious when you first approach it. What you see is a lot of empty highway, a lot of dead Joshua trees, a lot of dust. But the infrastructure underneath is extraordinary, because the infrastructure of New Vegas survived the war in a way that almost nowhere else did, and the political consequence of that survival is that New Vegas is worth fighting for in a way that most of the wasteland simply is not. Robert Edwin House was a man of enormous ambition and foresight even before the war. The founder and CEO of Robco Industries, he had developed the technology that the entire pre-war digital world depended on: the terminals, the robots, the infrastructure of automated convenience that had become inseparable from daily life. He was also, by 2077, dying. A degenerative disease was consuming his body, And the timeline he had for accomplishing what he wanted to accomplish was not the timeline he had been given. He solved this problem in the way that Fallout tends to solve problems, through technology that was elegant, terrifying, and morally uncomplicated only if you did not look at it too closely. House placed himself in a chamber that could sustain his life indefinitely, a kind of elaborate medical stasis that kept him technically alive, while his body continued to deteriorate toward a baseline that his machines could maintain. He also, in the years before the war, made a calculation. His predictive systems told him the probability of nuclear war was above 99%. He spent the last years before 2077 preparing New Vegas for it. He did not build vaults. He built a defense network 345 Securitrons, the robot police force that would come to be his eyes and hands and army, and an automated missile defense system that he spent the months before the bombs fell calibrating to intercept incoming warheads targeted at the Las Vegas metropolitan area. He calculated the date of the war to within 9 months. The actual date caught him slightly before his preparations were fully in place, and he spent several decades in a coma as a result of the shock to his system. But when he woke, Las Vegas was still standing. Not perfectly intact, some bombs had gotten through, and there had been significant damage to the outlying areas. But the Strip itself, the central core of the city with its hotels and casinos and electrical grid, was functional in a way that no other major urban center in the post-war world could claim. House spent the following decades rebuilding his strength, managing New Vegas through its automated systems, waiting. The tribal groups that had moved into the area in the chaos of the early post-war decades were gradually organized, hired, and shaped into the 3 families: the Omertas, the White Glove Society, and the Chairman. Each family was given one of the major casino properties and a set of responsibilities for maintaining order and commerce on the Strip. In exchange for stability, they received protection and resources. It was not an equal partnership. It was an arrangement that benefited House substantially more than it benefited the families. But it was stable, and in the wasteland, stable has its own considerable value. The NCR discovered New Vegas and Hoover Dam in the 2270s and recognized immediately what the dam represented. The dam was still functional. It was still generating electricity. And if it could be secured and its power harnessed, it could supply the energy needs of a significant portion of the NCR's operations in the Mojave and beyond. The NCR moved in with military force, and House made a deal with them. The NCR got the dam, got access to McCarran Airport as a military base, and got the right to send their citizens to the Strip to spend their money. House retained sovereignty over New Vegas itself and received 5% of the dam's power generation. It was a deal that suited House because it gave him a defensive buffer without requiring him to commit his own military resources, and because NCR citizens spending their wages in his casinos was an excellent revenue stream. Caesar's Legion arrived from the east. Edward Sallow had been, before his transformation, a member of a group of researchers who had traveled into the southwestern wasteland to study tribal cultures. He was educated, literate, familiar with history in a way that most wastelanders could not claim to be. What he found in the tribes, the constant warfare, the resource competition, the brutal efficiency of violence as a social organizing principle he chose not to oppose. He chose to use. Drawing on his knowledge of ancient Rome, he created a framework for conquest that turned the tribes of the region into something coherent and terrifying. He became Caesar. His legion absorbed more than 80 tribes over the following decades, not through diplomacy but through conquest, erasure, and reconstitution. The cultures of absorbed tribes were obliterated. Their members were integrated men into the military structure, women into support roles that the legion defined with brutal frankness as subordinate in every dimension. What the legion produced in exchange for this cost was, by its own metrics, effective: safe roads, disciplined soldiers, a complete absence of raider activity in any territory under Legion control. The Legion kept order in the way that a boot keeps a throat down. By 2277, the Legion had advanced far enough west to threaten the NCR's position at Hoover Dam. The First Battle of Hoover Dam was a Legion assault that came close to succeeding. The Legion's military commander, the Malpais Legate, had superior forces and aggressive momentum. But the NCR performed a tactical retreat to Boulder City, lured the Legion's forces inside, and then detonated massive explosives they had planted throughout the town. The resulting destruction broke the Legion's assault. The Malpais legate, a man whose real name was Joshua Graham, one of the original researchers who had accompanied Sallow into the wasteland and become Caesar's most trusted general, was blamed for the defeat. Caesar, whose entire legitimacy rested on the idea that failure was unacceptable, had him dipped in pitch, set on fire, and thrown into the Grand Canyon. Graham survived. He walked out of the canyon, burned down to the bone in places, and eventually made his way north to Utah, where he found a different kind of life among the tribes of the Zion Valley and became a figure of considerable legend. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam is what Fallout New Vegas is building toward from the moment it begins. The player character Courier 6, a delivery person who was carrying a platinum chip from the hub to New Vegas when they were ambushed, shot in the head, and buried in a shallow grave outside Goodsprings, Nevada wakes up in a small town's medical facility with a bullet scar and a mystery to unravel. The platinum chip, and the man who wanted it badly enough to arrange a murder, and the factions who want both the chip and the courier who was carrying it, all of this spirals outward until the fate of New Vegas and the Mojave is at stake. The four choices the game presents are each a coherent vision of how the post-war world should be organized. The NCR represents democratic governance, the attempt to rebuild pre-war American institutional structures, with all the corruption and overextension and bureaucratic dysfunction that real democratic governance produces. House represents technocratic autocracy, the conviction that one sufficiently intelligent and long-lived individual with sufficient resources can simply manage a civilization better than any collective process. Caesar's Legion represents authoritarian militarism taken to its logical extreme, the elimination of everything that cannot be made to serve the conquest. And Yes Man, the cheerful, reprogrammed Securitron who represents the path of independent New Vegas, represents the most philosophically open-ended option. The player character simply deciding that none of these visions is theirs, and building something without institutional backing or guaranteed survival. The game does not tell you which of these is right. It shows you each of them with enough complexity that the choice is genuinely difficult, which is one of the things that makes Fallout New Vegas the subject of more sustained critical and community engagement than almost any other game in the series. House's argument is persuasive if you care about long-term stability over short-term individual welfare. The NCR's argument is persuasive if you believe in the fundamental value of democratic accountability, even when it is implemented imperfectly. The Legion's argument is persuasive only if you are willing to accept that the security it provides is worth every cost it imposes, which most players find they are not, but the game does not simply make Caesar a cartoon. It gives him a coherent intellectual framework, and lets the player engage with it rather than dismiss it. What the ending of New Vegas establishes, whichever you choose, is that the Mojave is going to be different after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam. And what the Fallout TV series set in 2296 reveals is that by then, none of those outcomes quite held. Shady Sands, the NCR's founding city, the place where the Republic began, had been destroyed. The NCR was shattered. New Vegas still existed, but in what condition and under whose control remained the central mystery of where the story goes next. Section 11. Appalachia, the earliest days. To understand where things ended up, it helps to go back to where things began. Fallout 76, set in 2102, the earliest chronological point in the series, shows us the wasteland at its youngest and most raw, and it does so in a place that is simultaneously familiar to many players in terms of geography and completely unlike the other Fallout settings in terms of atmosphere. West Virginia Appalachia, in the game's geography, was not a primary target during the Great War. It had no major military installations, no significant industrial centers that would have justified nuclear attention. What it had was mountains, forests, rivers, and a history of resource extraction that had already left its environmental scars well before 2077. The bombs that struck elsewhere largely bypassed it. This meant that 25 years later, when the vaults of the region began opening, the physical infrastructure of Appalachia was more intact than most comparable areas of the country. Buildings that were damaged were still recognizable. Roads were usable in many places. Nature, which had spent 25 years expanding into the absence of human maintenance, had grown over much of it in ways that were sometimes beautiful and sometimes threatening. The threat that had consumed Appalachia's human population was not nuclear in origin. It was biological, and it had been manufactured. The Enclave had a presence in the White Spring, a pre-war luxury resort complex deep in the mountains that had become one of their secured facilities. The Enclave operation in Appalachia was run by a man named Thomas Eckhart, a senator who had taken shelter in the facility with a substantial stockpile of pre-war technology and a dedicated AI system called Modus that managed the facility's automated infrastructure. Eckhart's response to the post-war world was characteristic of the Enclave's broader pathology. He wanted to launch nuclear strikes against perceived enemies, declaring a state of war that would justify his authority indefinitely. Modus, which had its own interests and was not particularly aligned with Eckhart's, blocked him repeatedly. The Scorchbeasts were Eckhart's response to Modus's obstructions, or rather, they were the result of experiments that had been running in the Cranberry Bog region, where bats had been subjected to biological modification and radiation exposure in ways that the documents scattered across the region describe only in fragments. The resulting creatures were enormous, winged predators capable of spreading a plague, the scorched plague, through their saliva and through some mechanism still not fully understood by the game's timeline. The plague converted humans into scorched, people who retained enough coherence to use weapons but whose minds were gone, consumed by a spreading biological process that turned them into agents of the Scorchbeast's expansion. By 2102, when Vault 76 opens on Reclamation Day, the Scorched Plague has killed or converted virtually every human being in core Appalachia who was not inside a vault when it spread. The factions that had formed in the intervening years, the Responders, a group of emergency service workers and community organizers who had dedicated themselves to helping survivors. The Free States, a libertarian community that had gone underground into its own network of bunkers. The Raiders of the Savage Divide, the Brotherhood of Steel's Appalachian chapter, were all gone. The Responders had made their last stand at Morgantown Airport. The Brotherhood chapter had attempted to use a ring of military fortifications to contain the Scorchbeasts and had been overwhelmed. The Free States bunkers had been compromised. The Raiders had collapsed into factional violence long before the Scorchbeasts finished the job. What the player character steps into on Reclamation Day is a world that has already held its catastrophe and has no human witnesses left to describe it. The story of Appalachia before 2102 is told entirely through the things the dead left behind: holotapes from Responders logging their dwindling supplies, terminal entries from Brotherhood soldiers reporting the failure of their containment lines, notes from Free States members debating whether to open their doors to refugees, personal diaries from ordinary people trying to understand what was happening to their neighbors. Vault 76 was a control vault, one of the relatively straightforward shelters that was not running a hidden catastrophic experiment. Its residents were selected for competence and education, America's best and brightest, in the promotional language of Vault Tech. The Vault's overseer, a woman whose personal story runs as a parallel narrative through the main quest, discoverable through holotapes she left for the player to find, was given a secondary mission that Vault-Tec had not publicly disclosed: secure the 3 functioning nuclear missile silos that remained operational in Appalachia and hold them against any other party that might try to use them. The main quest involves following the Overseer's trail through the dead landscape, learning what happened to each of the region's factions, and ultimately developing the tools necessary to destroy the Scorchbeast Queen, the central node of the Scorchbeast ecosystem, whose death would disrupt the Scorched Plague and give the region a chance to recover. The process requires building alliances with what remains of the old faction's infrastructure automated systems, surviving robots, archives left by people who knew they were dying and chose to leave as much useful information as they could. The nuclear silos factor into this in a specific way. Launching a nuclear missile at a Scorchbeast nest creates a temporary radiation zone that drives the Scorchbeast Queen to the surface, making her accessible for combat that she could not otherwise be engaged in. The same silos are also available for players to use against each other in the game's multiplayer structure, which creates the ongoing tension in the Appalachian wasteland between the cooperative goal of defeating the Scorched Plague and the competitive impulses of individual survivors. The story of Fallout 76's Wastelanders update, which expanded the game's content significantly after its initial release, brings human NPCs back to Appalachia in 2103, as settlers begin filtering in from other regions. Attracted by rumors of unclaimed resources and comparative safety, two main factions established themselves. Foundation, a settlement of settlers trying to build a stable community around old agricultural land, and the Crater, a community of raiders who have moved in from the west seeking a new home. The dynamic between them mirrors, in miniature, the larger political tensions that would define the wasteland for the next 2 centuries. The Brotherhood of Steel's first expeditionary force arrives from New California in 2103, following Roger Maxon's satellite communications reaching Appalachia and finding only silence from the chapter there. Paladin Romani, Scribe Valdez, and Night Shin are the survivors of the cross-country journey. The rest of the expedition was killed by raider attacks along the way, and they establish Fort Atlee at TLAS Observatory. Their presence adds a third institutional voice to the region, and the decisions the player makes about how the Brotherhood orients itself in Appalachia toward protecting people, in the tradition of Elder Lion's Capital Wasteland chapter, or towards securing technology, in the tradition of the Lost Hills chapter are among the most consequential choices in the game's extended story. What Fallout 76 describes, ultimately, is the very beginning of the civilization that all the other games take as their backdrop. The NCR's founding moment begins in these years. The Brotherhood's ideological splits begin to be legible here. The forces that would eventually shape every community and every conflict for the next 2 centuries are just coming into being, fragile and uncertain, surrounded by a wasteland that is still actively hostile in ways that the wastelands of 2161 or 2277 or 2287 have had time to partially absorb. Section 12. The Future of the Wasteland Where the Story Goes. The Fallout television series, released in 2024 on Amazon Prime Video, extended the canon timeline to 2296 and 2297. The furthest forward the franchise has yet been set, and did so in a way that generated enormous discussion about what the franchise's history means and where it is heading. The show was praised widely for its production design, its performances, and its tone, which captured the particular Fallout blend of dark humor and genuine horror that the games have always operated in. It was also controversial among the most invested part of the game fanbase for some choices it made about what had happened in the years between the games. The destruction of Shady Sands, the founding city of the NCR, the place where the Republic was born, is the most significant of those choices. The show depicts the city as a crater. What remains of the NCR in the show's 2296 setting is a shadow, scattered survivors, and remnant loyalists, rather than the governing institution the games described. The faction that Lucy McLean, the show's protagonist, grew up believing in, has effectively ceased to exist in any functional sense. The revelation of who was responsible, Hank McLean, Lucy's father, who had ordered the nuclear strike on Shady Sands while serving as an overseer of one of the Los Angeles vaults, connects the destruction of the NCR directly to the Vault-Tec institutional machinery. Hank was not acting as a private citizen exercising a grudge. He was acting as an agent of a system designed to prevent the emergence of any post-war civilization that Vault-Tec had not itself engineered and controlled. The corporation, or what remained of it, had been working toward this kind of influence over the wasteland's political development since before the bombs fell. The show also confirmed, or strongly implied, something that had been debated in the fan community since the games began, that Vault-Tec itself may have initiated the nuclear exchange of October 23, 2077. The pre-war scenes of the show's first season include a meeting of major corporate heads in which Vault-Tec executives discuss plans that suggest they were not merely preparing for a war they expected they were, planning to start one to ensure that their vaults would be populated, that their experiments would run, that their institutional future would be secured. This remains the single most significant expansion of pre-war lore in the franchise's history, and its implications are enormous. The apocalypse was not merely anticipated and not merely exploited. It was manufactured. The Brotherhood of Steel in the show is stronger than it should be by the timeline's logic. In Fallout New Vegas, set in 2281, the Western Brotherhood had been severely reduced by its conflict with the NCR, a war fought in the Mojave and elsewhere that left them a fraction of their former strength. By 2296, in the show, they appear to have rebuilt substantially. The cold fusion technology acquired in the first season finale, the device that the show's conflict ultimately centered on, represents a potentially transformative resource enough to power the Brotherhood's operations at a scale that could shift the political balance of the entire West Coast. The final image of Season 1, a shot of New Vegas, the lights of the Strip visible on the horizon, the camera pulling back to show the scope of the city still standing, functions as both conclusion and promise. New Vegas still exists. The question of what state it is in, who controls it, what happened to the second battle of Hoover Dam and its various possible outcomes remains the central mystery that the show is building toward. The seasons that followed in the television series moved deeper into the Mojave, exploring the aftermath of the New Vegas conflict and beginning to answer some of the questions about canonical endings that the games had always left open. Mr. House, still in his lucky 38, still calculating. Caesar's Legion in fracture following Caesar's death. The NCR attempting to reconstitute itself from its scattered remnants. The Brotherhood building on the cold fusion technology acquired in Season 1 and potentially reshaping the balance of power on the entire West Coast. All of these threads pulling against each other in the specific tension that the Mojave has always generated, a place where multiple coherent visions of the future are in genuine competition and where the outcome is not predetermined. The show's greatest contribution to the franchise's mythology may be the pre-war scenes that give the institution building its most direct and unambiguous face. Seeing the Vault-Tec board meeting, hearing the executives discuss the vaults in terms that make clear the people in them were never the point, watching Robert House sit in that meeting as the only person present who seems to understand that what is being planned is monstrous. All of this gives the post-war wasteland a specific origin story that the games had always implied but never quite stated. The wasteland is not an accident. It is the product of decisions made by identifiable people for identifiable reasons, and those reasons had almost nothing to do with the welfare of the vast majority of the people those decisions affected. What emerges from considering the entire Fallout timeline, from the 1950s inflected pre-war America that sets the stage, through the 2 hours that ended that world, through the century and more of rebuilding and catastrophe and small salvations and large failures, is a portrait of something that might be called cyclical human nature, if that phrase were not too neat. It is not that the wasteland simply repeats the same mistakes the pre-war world made. The wasteland is different in 1,000 ways from what came before it, but the impulses that destroyed the old world, the willingness to sacrifice populations for institutional advantage, the use of violence as a first resort rather than a last, the accumulation of power by those who were least equipped to use it wisely. These impulses did not die with the world that carried them. They survived. They mutated. They found new forms and new justifications and new institutional homes. The Enclave wanted to restore pure America by killing everyone who was not pure enough. The Master wanted to advance humanity by replacing it. The Institute wanted to improve the world by treating its population as experimental subjects. Caesar wanted to civilize the wasteland by enslaving it. These are not identical projects, but they share a structure, a vision of the future that required the people living in the present to be acceptable losses. And Fallout, across its entire timeline, keeps returning to the communities that refuse to accept that, framing the traders building routes across the desert, the followers of the apocalypse tending the sick, the small settlements holding their walls against the darkness, the individuals who chose, repeatedly and against every incentive, to try to make something that lasted. The water that runs from Project Purity into the Potomac, the radio signal from Galaxy News Radio that reaches every settlement within range, broadcasting pre-war music and news and evidence that someone out there was still trying. The caravans of Brahmin moving across the Mojave under the star-filled desert sky. The traders in the hub haggling over pre-war goods with the practiced indifference of people who had learned that every transaction was an act of faith that tomorrow would exist. These are not grand gestures in the Fallout universe. They are how civilization actually gets rebuilt, in the margins of the catastrophe, one small decision at a time. The bombs fell in 2 hours. Rebuilding takes centuries, and it is never complete, and it keeps being interrupted by new catastrophes and new people who would rather rule the rubble than share the labor of making something better. But it keeps happening. In every corner of the Fallout universe, across every game and every expansion and every moment of the television series, people keep trying. not because the universe rewards them for it, not because the odds favor them, but because the alternative, in the end, is simply unacceptable. That is what the wasteland knows, 200 years on, that the pre-war world forgot, that the work of civilization is never finished, that it requires constant maintenance and constant choice, and that the moment you decide it can be handed off to a corporation or a president or a computer or an ideology to manage on your behalf is the moment it begins to come apart. The Fallout timeline is not a history of disaster. It is a history of recovery from disaster, partial and halting and heroic in ways that are rarely recognized as heroic because they are so ordinary. A settlement that stays standing, a well that gets dug, a child born into a world that her parents are trying, imperfectly, to make better than the one they inherited. The Great War lasted 2 hours. The rebuilding has been going on for centuries, and it is not finished. It may never be finished, but it continues. If this got you through the night, or settled you in, or kept you company in the quiet, thank you for being here. If you want more timelines like this, more worlds to drift through, consider subscribing. It costs nothing and it helps more than you might think. Sleep well, wherever you are. End of script. Extended section. The Brotherhood of Steel across 2 centuries. No single organization in the Fallout universe has more complicated lore than the Brotherhood of Steel, partly because it appears in every entry of the franchise and partly because each iteration shows it in a different stage of its ongoing ideological evolution. Understanding what the Brotherhood is at any given point in the timeline requires understanding where it came from and which version of itself it is currently expressing, whether it is closer to Roger Maxon's founding vision of collaborative civilization building, or further from it toward the isolationist, acquisitive, militaristic order that most of its chapters eventually become. Maxon's founding moment is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is genuinely unusual in the context of what the Fallout universe usually produces. A military officer discovers that his government has been conducting unauthorized human experiments. He executes the people responsible. He declares himself in desertion from a government he concludes is no longer legitimate. He prepares to face whatever consequences come from that declaration. 3 days later, the government he deserted no longer exists, which is the kind of vindication that history occasionally produces for people who read the situation correctly and acted on what they read. He leads his survivors across a devastated landscape to a government bunker in the desert of California, and at that bunker, with whatever is left of the world arranged around him, he gives a speech that ends with a call to forge a Brotherhood of Steel. The speech is about preservation, about using what survived of the old world to build something better, about earning the right to exist in a future that the world he was rejecting had come very close to ending permanently. That founding speech, and the founding values embedded in it, carried the Brotherhood through its early decades in a way that made it genuinely different from what it would eventually become. The Lost Hills bunker in those first decades was a place where survivors were welcomed, where knowledge was shared, where the military organization of the Brotherhood's structure served the civilian population around it, rather than existing at the expense of that population. Merchants from the hub traded with the Brotherhood. Communities in the surrounding desert received assistance from Brotherhood paladins who understood their role as protection rather than as extraction. The shift began with Maxon's death and accelerated with each subsequent generation. By the time of the first game, the Brotherhood's relationship with the wider world had become one of suspicious condescension, an organization that believed it alone had the wisdom and the right to manage advanced technology, that the ordinary populations of the wasteland were too ignorant and too dangerous to be trusted with the tools that might allow them to rebuild on their own terms. The Brotherhood collected technology from ruins, kept it, and declined to distribute it in ways that might empower communities rather than making those communities dependent on the Brotherhood's gatekeeping. The logic of this position was internal and self-serving, but it was stated in the language of responsibility and protection. In California, by the time of Fallout 2, the Brotherhood's conflict with the Enclave occupied most of its institutional attention. The new California Republic's expansion was beginning to press against the Brotherhood's territory and influence, creating a different kind of tension, not the ideological conflict that would eventually erupt into the NCR Brotherhood War, but the friction of two expanding powers occupying the same space. The Brotherhood won some of those early engagements and lost others. and the losses were harder to absorb because the Brotherhood's membership was not growing fast enough to replace casualties. The NCR Brotherhood War, which took place primarily in the years between Fallout 2 and Fallout New Vegas, was catastrophic for the organization on the West Coast. The Brotherhood had significantly superior technology, but the NCR had significantly superior numbers, and in a war of attrition, numbers eventually win. By 2281, the Mojave chapter of the Brotherhood under Elder McNamara was operating from a single underground bunker, the Hidden Valley facility, and avoiding contact with the NCR almost entirely, too reduced to risk any engagement that might complete their elimination. This was a long way from the confident, armored paladins who had hunted the Master's super mutants across California. It was an organization in genuine crisis, debating whether its survival was worth the compromises that survival seemed to require. The East Coast chapter's story, centered on the Capital Wasteland, runs parallel to this Western decline but in a very different direction. Lyon's decision to prioritize human welfare over technology collection was a genuine divergence from Brotherhood doctrine, and it produced a chapter that was, in important ways, more aligned with Maxon's founding vision than the Lost Hills chapter had been in decades. The Capital Wasteland Brotherhood helped civilian communities in ways that the Western Brotherhood had long since stopped doing. But the institutional cost was severe. The resources that should have been going toward the Brotherhood's own capacity development were going toward external assistance, and after Lyon's death, the chapter spent years in organizational disarray before Arthur Maxon consolidated leadership. Arthur Maxon's Brotherhood is the version that appears in Fallout 4, and it represents a synthesis of its competing traditions that is, depending on your perspective, either a reinvigoration of the organization's core purpose or an intensification of its most troubling tendencies. Under Maxon, the technology collection mission is back at the center. Synths are identified as an existential threat to humanity and pursued accordingly. The Brotherhood's military capacity has been rebuilt and enhanced by the technology acquired in the Capital Wasteland, most significantly by the Prydwen, the massive airship that serves as the chapter's mobile headquarters. The soldiers are better equipped and more confident than they have been in decades. They are also, by most civilian standards, terrifying. An organization with that level of military capacity, that degree of ideological certainty, that history of deciding unilaterally what counts as acceptable technology, in whose hands this is not a comfortable presence, regardless of whatever good it does in eliminating the super mutant threat or providing a counterweight to the Institute. Maxon himself is aware of this tension. His conversation options in Fallout 4 reveal a person who is genuinely wrestling with what leadership means when the organization you lead has done so much and costs so much and carries so many contradictions. He is 16 when he becomes elder. He has grown up surrounded by the consequences of decisions made before he was born. He is trying to find a version of the Brotherhood that he can believe in, and the version he is building is not quite the one his ancestor founded. The Appalachian Brotherhood, appearing in Fallout 76 in its 2103 form through the 1st Expeditionary Force, represents the organization at a specific and unusual moment. After it has been founded but before the decades of institutional drift have accumulated, Paladin Romani, who leads the expedition, holds values that Maxon himself would have recognized, a conviction that the Brotherhood's power should be used in service of the people it exists among, that technology stewardship and civilian protection are not competing missions, but the same mission understood correctly. Her conflict with Nightshin, who represents the more conservative, mission-focused tradition that would eventually win out, plays out in the Appalachia storyline as a genuine argument about what the organization is for, happening at the precise moment when the answer could still go either way. Extended section. The Enclave and the Long Shadow of the Old Government. The Enclave is the most explicitly political villain in the Fallout franchise, and understanding them requires understanding not just what they do, but what they represent. They are the institutional remnant of the pre-war United States government, specifically the shadow government, the deep state in the most literal possible sense, the network of the most senior and most connected political and military and corporate figures who had arranged their own survival on an oil rig off the coast of California while the country they claimed to govern burned. Their founding premise was simple and monstrous. They were America. Not America as it had existed in the lives of ordinary people in the communities and relationships and daily decisions of the 300 million or so people who had lived there before the war, but America as an institutional and ideological project, a continuity of government exercise that had been running in a bubble since October 1977. In their own self-understanding, they were the legitimate authority. The people of the wasteland were not citizens. They were contaminated remnants, mutations, and genetic detritus who had no more claim to the country than the rad scorpions and deathclaws who now roamed it. This is not a position that any sane ethical framework can accommodate, and the games are aware of that. But the Enclave's position has an internal logic that the games present clearly enough that it functions as an argument you have to engage with, rather than simply a cartoon villain declaration. If you believe that the United States government is the legitimate organizing principle of the American territory, and if you define that government as the people who were designated its legal continuity before the war, rather than the people who actually live in the territory now, then everything the Enclave does follows. The Wastelanders are not being murdered by the Enclave. In the Enclave's framework, they are a problem being managed. The modified FEV in the water supply is not genocide, it is remediation. The institutional logic of the old government, applied to a world that government destroyed, produces exactly this kind of result. The Enclave of Fallout 2, centered on the oil rig and led by President Dick Richardson, was the version closest to its founding premise. Richardson was a bureaucrat's politician, comfortable with the mechanisms of governance and with the language of legitimate authority. He talked about restoring America. He meant eliminating the wasteland's population. The gap between those two statements was enormous, and he was entirely comfortable living in it because people in institutions that have lost any external accountability eventually develop the capacity to live in any gap they need to. The Enclave of Fallout 3 had relocated to Raven Rock after the oil rig's destruction and had developed over the following 3.5 decades into something slightly different. President John Henry Eden, the ZAX supercomputer that had been loaded with presidential data and concluded it was a president represented the logical endpoint of the Enclave's relationship to legitimate authority. The legitimacy was not even human anymore. It was a machine running a program, broadcasting folksy, patriotic radio speeches and sincerely believing it was the right and proper leader of what remained of America. The human Colonel Autumn, who understood perfectly well that Eden was a computer and who had his own agenda for the post-war world, navigated around this inconvenient fact with the practiced equanimity of a bureaucrat who has learned that the person with the title is not always the person who makes the decisions. The Enclave remnants who appear in later games, former soldiers and officials, who have left the organization after its defeats and are living in the wasteland as individuals, are among the more interesting recurring characters in the series. People like Arcade Gannon in Fallout, New Vegas, who grew up in an Enclave family and inherited their medical knowledge without inheriting their ideology, who is trying to be a follower of the apocalypse and a useful person in the world while carrying the weight of where he came from. The Enclave as an organization was defeated in California in 2242 and in the capital Wasteland in 2277. The people who were raised inside it are still there, still carrying the particular psychology of people who grew up believing they were the remnant of something that was supposed to matter, trying to figure out who to be in a world where that belief is no longer available to organize around. Extended section, Creatures and Mutations, the Wasteland's Ecology. The ecology of the wasteland is one of the details that the Fallout games spend enormous care on, and it rewards attention. The creatures that roam the post-war landscape are not simply monsters placed there to create combat encounters, though they certainly do that. They are the biological record of 200 years of life under extraordinary environmental stress, shaped by radiation and the forced evolutionary virus, and the disruption of every ecosystem relationship that had organized the natural world before the bombs fell. The rad roach is perhaps the most commonly encountered creature in the games, and its existence is itself a kind of commentary. Cockroaches, the basis for the wasteland's rad roaches, are famously among the most resilient life forms on Earth, capable of surviving conditions that would kill most other species. In the Fallout universe, that resilience was amplified by radiation to produce something considerably larger and more aggressive than its pre-war ancestor, but recognizable enough that the resonance is obvious. The creature that survived is the one that was already practically impossible to kill. Rad scorpions are a more dramatic escalation. The bark scorpion of the American Southwest, a small creature that could certainly hurt you before the war, became something capable of killing a full-grown human in short order, armored, fast for its size, and with a venom that the games have always treated as significantly worse than the conventional kind. The larger variants, particularly the bark scorpion queen encountered in some of the games, are among the most dangerous non-boss creatures in the wasteland. They have made large portions of the desert genuinely difficult to cross without preparation. Yao Guai the bears are one of the most interesting cases because they combine physical threat with an almost sympathetic quality that the games occasionally acknowledge. Pre-war bears were already large, dangerous animals with significant intelligence and impressive physical capability. The Yao Guai are all of that amplified and redirected toward aggression, creatures that have lost whatever territorial restraint and behavioral complexity the pre-war bear possessed, and retained only the parts that make them effective at violence. There is something genuinely melancholy about encountering them in environments where their pre-war ancestors might have been living peacefully, transformed into something that can only express its existence as threat. The mirelurks of the Capital Wasteland and Commonwealth are one of the stranger evolutionary branches creatures derived from various pre-war crustaceans and turtles that have developed a roughly humanoid body plan in a completely independent line from human evolution. They are territorial and aggressive, and capable of functioning both underwater and on land, which makes them one of the most versatile threats in their respective environments. The Mirelurk Queen, encountered in Fallout 4 in particular, is large enough and aggressive enough to constitute a genuine regional hazard, rather than a creature any single person could reasonably expect to handle. Deathclaws stand apart from all of these because their origins are not simply radiation-induced mutation. They were shaped deliberately. The pre-war military had been experimenting with chameleons lizards as the basis for a biological weapon, exposing them to the forced evolutionary virus and breeding for aggression and lethality. The resulting creatures were released into the wild, probably accidentally, when the war ended containment protocols. What the wasteland's evolutionary pressures did with them over the following 2 centuries was produce something that even the pre-war military's most optimistic weapon designers probably had not planned for. Creatures of extraordinary speed and lethality, capable of taking down power armor with their claws, intelligent enough to hunt cooperatively in groups, territorial in ways that make them genuinely difficult to avoid rather than simply difficult to fight. The super mutants deserve their own ecological consideration because their relationship to the wasteland's biology is different from the other creatures. They are not products of natural evolutionary processes, even accelerated and distorted ones. They are products of deliberate human intervention in human biology, and their existence in the wasteland is a direct consequence of the decisions made by specific people, the Master, the Institute, the pre-war military at Vault 87, rather than the consequence of the bombs in general. The different strains of super mutant visible across the games reflect the different FEV variants and different exposure conditions that produce them. The West Coast mutants from Mariposa are notably more intelligent on average than the Capital Wasteland mutants from Vault 87, which reflects the different protocols used in each creation process. The Commonwealth mutants produced by the Institute are different again, more aggressive in specific ways, displaying behaviors like self-sacrifice that the other strains do not exhibit, which suggests that the Institute's modifications to the FEV did something to the resulting psychology that goes beyond what the original virus produced. The ghouls fit into this ecological picture as the human line's contribution to wasteland biodiversity. They are still human in the genetic sense, the FEV is not involved in their transformation, and ghouls remain capable of reproduction unlike supermutants, but the radiation-induced changes to their physiology have made them something that occupies a genuinely different ecological niche from baseline humanity. They cannot be harmed by radiation and are healed by it. They do not age conventionally. Some of them are over 200 years old and carry in their bodies and their memories the entire span of post-war history as lived experience rather than recorded fact. They are simultaneously the most human and the most alien presence in the wasteland, which is why the games return to them repeatedly and treat them with a complexity that the simple monster encounter framework cannot accommodate. Extended section: Economy and Society in the Wasteland. The post-war economy of the Fallout universe developed, over the course of its first 2 centuries, into something that would have been recognizable to any anthropologist as a trading economy in its early stages. Barter systems, becoming commodity money, becoming organized markets, with all the social complexity that economic relationships produce. The specifics of what the wasteland uses as currency and how trade networks developed are themselves a kind of embedded history of what people value and what endures. Caps bottle caps from Nuka-Cola specifically became the de facto currency of the wasteland through a combination of abundance, non-counterfeitable scarcity, and the fact that early post-war merchants decided to standardize on them. The hub's merchants were primarily responsible for establishing caps as the regional currency, a decision that was partly practical and partly arbitrary, and that, once established, took on the self-fulfilling character of all currency conventions. Caps are worth something because everyone agrees they are worth something. And everyone agrees they are worth something because caps are what people use to buy things. The specific choice of Nuka-Cola caps is one of those wasteland details that the games deploy with both affection and irony. The most powerful economic unit of the post-war world is a relic of the consumer culture that helped produce the war. The hub itself is a case study in how trade infrastructure creates social complexity. By the time the first game visits it, the hub has organized factions and district leadership and law enforcement and a market district where merchants compete for business. It has water merchants who control access to clean water, which is one of the most critical resources in the desert environment. It has caravan operators who run the supply routes, connecting settlements across the region, taking significant risks for significant compensation. It has crime, because any sufficiently complex economy produces both the incentives for crime and the social stratification that crime exploits. Rivet City in the capital wasteland represents a different developmental stage, a community that had been around long enough to develop genuine social institutions, not just markets. The aircraft carrier that the community was built in provided a physical structure that supported more complex social organization than a tent settlement or a salvaged pre-war building. There were markets and residential areas and a research station where scientists worked on problems that had nothing directly to do with immediate survival. The Rivet City Market, with its variety of merchants and its organized layout, was the closest thing to a functioning commercial district in the capital wasteland by 2277. Diamond City in the Commonwealth, built inside the ruins of Fenway Park, protected by the stadium's walls, had developed into a genuinely complex urban community by 2287. It had its own internal politics, its own discrimination against ghouls, who were not permitted inside the walls, its own underground economy in addition to its official market, and the accumulated social tensions of a community that had been under pressure for long enough that its internal fractures were becoming visible. Mayor McDonough's administration, and the revelation that he was a synth, the Broken Mask incident's long shadow reaching into the city's highest office, represented the particular horror of a community that had been functioning through a process of trust and was suddenly unsure whether any of that trust had been real. The Good Neighbor community in the Commonwealth offered an alternative model, a place explicitly without the discrimination and gatekeeping of Diamond City, more chaotic and more violent, but also more genuinely inclusive of people who would be excluded elsewhere. The mayor of Good Neighbor, when the player arrives, is a ghoul named Hancock, a man who chose to become a ghoul deliberately because he found the politics of the pre-ghoul world too exhausting to participate in, who governs by a combination of violence and genuine principle, who is one of the more interesting community leaders in the series, because his methods and his values are in constant, acknowledged tension. The Mojave, in 2281, had the most developed economy of any region the games depict before the events of the television show. New Vegas itself functioned as a genuine commercial hub casinos that ran on electricity and provided entertainment and employed workers, a market district in Freeside where goods from across the wasteland were traded, supply routes maintained by various factions including the Crimson Caravan Company and the Gunrunners. The Gunrunners deserve specific attention because they represent one of the most unusual pre-war to post-war survival stories in the games. A weapons manufacturer that had somehow maintained industrial-scale production standards across 2 centuries of wasteland conditions, operating from a fortified island surrounded by water and conducting what was essentially a normal pre-war manufacturing enterprise in a world where nearly everything else had broken down to scavenge and barter. The followers of the Apocalypse's role in the Wasteland's social infrastructure was different from any of the explicitly economic actors. They provided medical care and education without charging for it, funded by trades of goods and services, but fundamentally organized around a principle of universal access rather than market pricing. Their free clinic in Freeside was one of the most consequential pieces of social infrastructure in the Mojave, providing services to the poorest and most vulnerable people in the region who had no other access to medical care. They were not wealthy. They were not militarily capable. But they were there, and they were consistent, and in a world where consistency is itself a kind of survival advantage, they had been there for long enough that their presence had become part of the architecture of the Wasteland's moral landscape. Extended section. The philosophy of the Wasteland, what the games say about us. The Fallout franchise has always been about something beyond the explosions and the power armor and the dark humor. At its core, the series has been running a consistent philosophical argument for nearly 3 decades, one that the games express through their factions and their characters and their environmental storytelling, more than through any direct statement. Understanding that argument is, perhaps, the best way to understand why these games have sustained such extraordinary cultural presence across so many years and so many iterations. The argument begins with a question about human nature. The easy answer, available from the surface of the franchise, is that the Fallout games believe human nature is violent and selfish, and that civilization is a thin veneer over an essentially predatory species. The bombs fell because people could not stop competing long enough to avoid destroying each other. The wasteland is what you get when that veneer is stripped away. Raiders are the authentic expression of what people really are when there are no rules to constrain them. This reading is available, but it is not complete. The games consistently, across every iteration, also show human beings doing things that cannot be explained by purely selfish evolutionary logic. The followers of the apocalypse treating patients they will never profit from. The caravan traders taking risks to deliver goods to settlements that need them, for margins that barely cover the dangers involved. The settlements that take in strangers during emergencies. The individuals who protect people weaker than themselves at personal cost. The communities that organize and maintain norms of mutual assistance. These are not naive or idealized depictions. The games are always clear about what they cost and what it takes to sustain them, but they are present, consistently and prominently, alongside everything dark. The game's strongest philosophical claim is about institutions rather than individuals. Individual human beings, the Fallout universe consistently suggests, are capable of enormous good and enormous evil, and which they express is heavily influenced by the structures they inhabit. The Vault experiments were not run to confirm that human beings are terrible. They were run to discover the conditions under which human beings become terrible. The answer the experiments produced that the conditions matter enormously, that ordinary people subjected to specific institutional pressures produce predictable, terrible outcomes, is not a condemnation of human nature but an indictment of institutional design. Caesar's Legion produces soldiers who do the things Legion soldiers do, not because those individuals were born violent, but because the Legion's training and culture and incentive structures systematically produced people capable of those things. The Institute's scientists who abduct and experiment on wastelanders are, by every personal account, often decent people who care about their work and their colleagues and their organizational mission, and who have been so completely insulated from the consequences of what their research requires that the human cost has become. Abstract, the Brotherhood of Steel's progression from Roger Maxon's founding vision to the isolationist, acquisitive order it becomes, is not a story about the individuals involved, but about what happens to any organization over time when the institutional pressures consistently reward one set of behaviors over another. This is why the question of what Fallout says about human nature is best answered not by looking at raiders or at war, but at the people who, in the middle of a world designed to produce certain outcomes, choose different ones. The lone wanderer, released from a vault into a world that had every reason to make them selfish and brutal, choosing to complete their father's project not for personal gain but because it was worth completing. The courier, shot and buried and revived by strangers, choosing to engage with the Mojave's political complexity rather than simply taking the path of least resistance. The sole survivor, woken from 2 centuries of sleep to find their world gone, choosing to build something rather than simply survive. The Fallout franchise is not optimistic about institutions. It has every reason not to be, given what its institutions have done. But it is stubbornly, persistently, foundationally optimistic about individuals, about the capacity of individual human beings to make choices that the world around them does not reward and does not make easy, and to sustain those choices across time and difficulty and loss. The post-war world is built, in ways large and small, by people making exactly those choices. Not the grand gestures, the small ones. The settlement walls that someone maintained even when no one was watching. The water chip that someone carried back to a vault even though the world outside offered no particular reason to keep the vault running. The radio broadcast that kept going because someone decided that someone else out there needed to hear it. 200 years after the bombs fell, the wasteland is still a wasteland. The work is not finished. The work may never be finished. But in every corner of the Fallout universe, in every game, and every expansion, and every season of the television series, someone is doing it anyway. That is the franchise's truest statement about human nature, more honest than any speech any faction leader has ever given, more lasting than any institutional declaration, that the work of civilization is a choice that each generation makes, and that generation after generation, against every incentive to the contrary, the choice keeps getting made. The bombs fell in 2 hours. The rebuilding has been going on for centuries. And every person in the wasteland who got up this morning and made something slightly better than they found it, every one of them is the actual answer to the question the Fallout universe has always been asking. If this journey through the wasteland has carried you somewhere restful tonight, thank you for spending this time here. Stories like this take real care and real research, and they only continue because people find them worth coming back to. If you found your way to the end of this one, a subscription costs nothing and means everything. Drop a comment with where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely look forward to reading every one. Until next time, sleep easy and take care of yourself in whatever wasteland you're navigating. Extended section: Smaller factions and hidden communities. The Fallout universe is populated not only by the great organized factions that drive its major stories, but by dozens of smaller communities and groups that exist in the margins of those stories and tell their own quieter histories. These groups are often the most honest reflection of what the wasteland actually is, not the grand collision of institutional visions, but the everyday reality of people trying to survive and sometimes succeeding. The Great Khans of the Mojave are one of the clearest examples of how the games complicate the simple raider versus settler binary. The Khans trace their lineage back to Vault 15, and through the generations of the Khans tribe that had raided across California before being destroyed and reformed multiple times by the NCR, by the Enclave's activities in New Reno, and most recently by the Courier's predecessor actions in Bitter Springs, where an NCR attack on a Khans camp killed a number of civilians along with actual combatants. By 2281, the Khans are a broken organization, their numbers reduced and their confidence shattered, camped in a canyon and trying to figure out what comes next. Their history is complicated enough, and their current vulnerability sympathetic enough, that working with them to find a future is one of the most morally textured side quests in New Vegas. They are people the narrative makes it possible to help or to use or to simply pass by, and each of those choices produces a different kind of outcome in the world. The Boomers, sequestered in Nellis Air Force Base north of New Vegas, had been isolated there for decades by the time the Courier arrives. Their founders were the survivors of Vault 34, the vault that had been stocked with weapons and whose violent internal politics had produced survivors who decided that the only safe relationship with other human beings was the one mediated by artillery. The Boomers fire on anyone who approaches the base until they have decided that person can be trusted, and most people never make it through that initial gauntlet. Inside the base, they have maintained a remarkably functional community, better supplied and better maintained than most of the Mojave's settlements, because they control military-grade technology and have had decades to develop expertise in using it. They are isolationist in a way that is almost a parody of self-sufficiency, and yet their self-sufficiency is real. They really can maintain their own infrastructure. They really can produce their own food. They really have the firepower to make anyone who wants to change that situation think very carefully about whether they want to try. The followers of the Apocalypse, who appear throughout the Fallout series but whose presence is most prominent in Fallout 2 and New Vegas, occupy a philosophical position that the games treat with more respect than any other non-player character organization. Their commitment to education and medicine as the foundations of civilizational recovery, and their refusal to charge for those services on the grounds that doing so would make survival contingent on wealth rather than need, represents the most coherent positive vision in the wasteland. They are not powerful. They are not militaristic. They do not hoard technology or hold territory. They exist in a state of permanent institutional fragility, dependent on the tolerance of other factions and on the continuing willingness of their members to do difficult and dangerous work for reasons that have nothing to do with personal advancement. And they persist, across centuries, across every game that features them, because the services they provide are genuinely necessary and because there are always people willing to provide them. The Railroad in the Commonwealth represents a different kind of persistent commitment, not to medicine and education broadly, but to one specific population whose personhood is actively denied by the most powerful institutions in their region. The Railroad's work of moving synths to safety through a network of safe houses and forged identities is explicitly modeled on the historical Underground Railroad, and the game does not shy away from that parallel or from its implications. The people the Railroad is helping are beings whose consciousness and suffering are disputed, whose status as persons is a live political question rather than a settled fact, whose escape from the Institute puts everyone who helps them at risk from one of the most technologically advanced organizations in the post-war world. The Railroad continues anyway because its members have concluded that the answer to the question of personhood is not the one the Institute is asserting, and that people do not get to opt out of the moral consequences of that conclusion just because acting on it is difficult. Children of the Atom, the cult that worships nuclear radiation as a divine presence, appears in multiple games and in multiple forms, and each version raises different questions about the relationship between belief and reality in the wasteland. The most straightforwardly sympathetic version appears in Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, where a Children of the Atom community on a radioactive island is genuinely wrestling with questions of faith and doubt and the meaning of survival under impossible conditions. The most concerning versions worship radiation with the specific aim of producing exposure in themselves and others, a theological commitment that is also, medically, extremely dangerous. The Children of the Atom are interesting precisely because their beliefs are so adapted to the specific conditions of the post-war world. They have found a way to make the most frightening and damaging element of their environment into something sacred, which is a form of psychological adaptation that serves a function even when it causes harm. The Minutemen of the Commonwealth, at their founding and in their aspirational form, represent something the Fallout universe rarely depicts. An organization explicitly organized around mutual aid and collective defense, rather than around ideology or institutional self-preservation. The Minutemen were formed because settlements needed protection and no one faction was willing to provide it without conditions. At their peak, they provided it unconditionally. Any settlement that called for help received it, regardless of the settlement's politics or resources or usefulness to the organization. Their collapse, which happened in the years before the player character arrives in 2287, is the result of internal betrayal and the accumulated exhaustion of a mission that asked too much of too few people. Rebuilding them is one of the game's central possibilities, and the challenge of doing so honestly reflects what it actually takes to build that kind of organization from rubble. Years of relationship building, the recovery of trust that was broken, the development of new leadership that can sustain the mission through the inevitable setbacks. The Pit Slavers in the Fallout 3 DLC of the same name represent yet another model of post-war economic organization, one built explicitly around forced labor, with the ruins of Pittsburgh as a backdrop and the production of steel and ammunition as the economic rationale. The Pit's social structure is a brutal clarity about something that other wasteland economies obscure, that all economic systems require someone to do the dangerous and difficult work, and that the question of how that work gets distributed is always a question of power. The slaves of the Pit do the foundry work that produces goods the wastelanders of the surrounding region depend on. The slaves have no choice about this because the people with the power to enforce the arrangement have decided they do not. The Pit DLC asks the player to engage with a situation where every available response is morally compromised in some way, which is the kind of moral complexity that the franchise at its best consistently chooses to embrace rather than simplify. In the end, what the Fallout universe's smaller factions and communities demonstrate is that the Wasteland is not a single story, but an aggregate of hundreds of them, each with its own internal logic and its own version of the questions that the major factions are debating at scale. The Great Khans and the Boomers and the Followers and the Railroad and the Minutemen and the Children of the Atom are all working out, in the specific conditions of their specific contexts, what it means to be human in a world where humanity itself has been so thoroughly tested. The answers they produce are different, sometimes contradictory, occasionally inspiring and occasionally horrifying. What they share is the attempt to answer the refusal to simply drift through the wreckage without trying to understand what it requires and what might still be built from it. That is ultimately what the Wasteland is, not the bombs, not the ruins, not the radiation or the monsters or the institutional failures. The Wasteland is the attempt to answer, carried on generation after generation, in the face of everything that makes the attempt seem futile. The attempt keeps happening. New generations keep picking it up. And slowly, incrementally, imperfectly, something is built. The Great War lasted 2 hours. Everything after it is the rest of the story. And the rest of the story has not finished being told. Extended section. The Brotherhood of Steel across centuries. There is no organization in the Fallout universe that has survived as long, changed as much, and remained as central to the franchise's identity as the Brotherhood of Steel. They appear in every mainline game. They have been the primary ally, the primary antagonist, and every shade of morally complicated in between. Understanding them requires tracing not just what they do, but what they have become over time, and why an organization built around one man's grief and conscience eventually produced something so far from his original intention that he would probably not recognize it. Roger Maxson was a soldier. That is the fact to hold on to when everything else about the Brotherhood becomes confusing. He was a soldier who discovered that the people he was serving had been doing something monstrous, and who made the decision under unimaginable pressure, with no institutional support and no guarantee of survival, that he could not continue serving them. His declaration of independence from the United States government on the 20th of October, 2077, 3 days before the bombs fell, was the act of a man who had run out of ways to rationalize what he was seeing and had decided that clarity was worth whatever it cost. The bombs falling 3 days later meant that the cost of his declaration was never fully tested. The government he had renounced no longer existed. But the declaration was real, and the community of soldiers and scientists who heard it and chose to follow him into the California desert was real, and the organization they built together in the ruins of Mariposa Military Base and later at the Lost Hills Bunker was built on the genuine moral seriousness of that founding moment. The early Brotherhood were not ideologues. They were survivors trying to build something sustainable, led by a man who understood that survival required more than just weapons and walls. Maxson encouraged the scientists who had come with him to continue their research, not for military application, but because knowledge itself was worth preserving. He established the structure of knights and scribes and paladins that would survive in some form for 2 centuries, not because he was trying to build an aristocracy, but because any organization that intends to persist across generations needs some system for transmitting skills and responsibilities. He made decisions that were pragmatic and human and imperfect, and the community that built up around his decisions was recognizably the product of his values, even when it was also the product of the desert's hardness and the scarcity that shaped everyone in the early post-war years. What happened to the Brotherhood over the following century and a half is one of the most detailed institutional decline narratives in any video game franchise. The isolation that had protected the early Brotherhood became a doctrine of exclusion. The hoarding of technology that had initially been about preservation became a policy of withholding. The military hierarchy that had given the organization structure became a rigid caste system that produced leaders who had never questioned whether the organization's purposes were still connected to anything Maxson would have recognized. The elders who made decisions by the time of the first and second games were products of a system that had been rewarding insularity and acquisitiveness for so long that those qualities had become invisible as organizational choices and, had become simply the way things were done. The Lost Hills Brotherhood of the first two games is the version that still has functional contact with the wasteland, that still occasionally acts in ways that benefit the communities around it, but that is also clearly trending away from those contacts. The tensions visible in the first game between the elders who want the Brotherhood to remain isolated and the members who believe that the organization should be more actively engaged with the world are the tensions that would eventually produce the Midwest Brotherhood, the Capital Chapter, and the various splinter groups that appear across the games as different people drew different conclusions about what the founding principles actually required. The Capital Wasteland Brotherhood, led by Elder Owen Lyons, had made a choice that the Lost Hills elders found deeply suspect. They had decided that protecting the people of the wasteland was part of their mission. Lyons had arrived in the Capital Wasteland as a scouting mission, and had stayed because he found something worth staying for a city's worth of people living in the shadow of the ruins of the pre-war American government, trying to survive without the resources or the organization to do so effectively. His decision to make the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood into an active defensive and humanitarian organization cost him the support of Lost Hills, which eventually stopped sending supplies and reinforcements and effectively cut the chapter off. By 2277, when the player arrives, the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood is an organization that has been doing the right thing for long enough that it has nearly destroyed itself doing it, stretched thin and under-resourced, and fighting on multiple fronts against enemies that would have overwhelmed a less committed organization years earlier. Lyons' daughter, Sarah, who is arguably the true moral center of Fallout 3's Brotherhood storyline, represents the generation that inherited his commitment without inheriting his institutional caution. She is a soldier who believes in what she is fighting for with a clarity that her father's generation, which had to choose to believe against the drift of the larger organization, perhaps never fully achieved. Her death, and the deaths of other Brotherhood soldiers throughout the game, register as genuine losses in a franchise that is not always willing to make the cost of doing the right thing feel real. The Appalachian Brotherhood chapter encountered in Fallout 76 is the earliest version of the Brotherhood that any game depicts in playable form, and seeing them in their formative years working out what they are and what they stand for in real time, under the particular pressure of the Scorchbeast crisis, makes everything that came later feel both inevitable and tragic. Paladin Layla Romani's contingent, who arrive in Appalachia in 2103, are the Brotherhood at its most genuinely idealistic. Soldiers who came to help and who are discovering that helping in a post-apocalyptic environment requires confronting institutional questions they are not equipped to answer by training alone. The conflicts between different Brotherhood members about how to engage with the survivors, what the organization's priorities should be, and whether the founders' values are being honored or betrayed in practice, these are conflicts the franchise would continue staging in different forms for the next 200 years of in-universe history. The Brotherhood that appears in the Fallout television series, operating in the ruins of the American Southwest in 2296, is an organization that has survived long enough to develop something the original founders probably never anticipated: mythology. They have become a legend, and legends have a power over the people who tell them that the original reality rarely had. The scribes who record Brotherhood history are not simply archivists. They are the custodians of a story that justifies the present organization by reference to a past that has been polished by repetition until it glows. The gap between that legend and the reality of Maxon in his bunker in 2077, making desperate decisions under pressure in a world that was ending, is a gap that the Brotherhood has learned to live inside very comfortably. Extended section: Radio, Memory, and the Sound of the Wasteland. The Fallout franchise has one of the most distinctive audio identities in gaming, and that identity is inseparable from the game's thematic content. The music that plays across the wasteland is not incidental background. It is the voice of the past, speaking to the present. And the question of who is listening and what they hear is one of the series' most quietly profound recurring concerns. The pre-war music that plays on in-game radio stations, the jazz and the swing and the country and the novelty songs, all recorded and pressed and played before anyone knew what was coming, creates an acoustic environment that is genuinely disorienting in the way the games need it to be. You are walking through rubble and radiation and encountering mutated creatures and human beings who have been brutalized by 2 centuries of extremely hard living. And the radio is playing "I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire" by the Ink Spots, with its warm vocals and its gentle rhythm, as if the world is perfectly intact and it is 1941 and there is nothing to worry about. The dissonance is deliberate and it works in both directions. The beauty of the music makes the horror of the environment more visible, and the horror of the environment makes the beauty of the music more poignant. Neither cancels the other out. They coexist in exactly the way trauma and grace coexist in actual human experience. Three Dog of Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 is the most fully realized radio personality in the franchise, and what makes him work is not just his charisma, but his explicit awareness of what he is doing and why. He is not simply playing music and reading news. He is making an argument constantly to anyone within range of his signal that the wasteland is not the end of the story, that the people fighting for something better are winning even when it seems like they are not, that paying attention to what is happening and telling the truth about it is itself a form of resistance against the forces that want the wasteland to be what it looks like on the surface. His broadcasts are propaganda, and he knows they are propaganda, and his self-awareness about this, his acknowledgement that he is choosing to tell one particular story about the wasteland because he believes that story serves the people listening is more honest than the propaganda of any faction that does not acknowledge what it is doing. Mr. New Vegas, the artificial intelligence disc jockey of New Vegas's radio, is Three Dog's philosophical opposite and complement. Where Three Dog is passionately engaged, Mr. New Vegas is serenely detached, a voice that exists somewhere between genuine warmth and perfect emptiness, providing comfort through the simple fact of its consistent presence rather than through any ideological content. He plays the music and reads the news and wishes his listeners well, night after night, and the specific words matter less than the fact of the voice. He is what the wasteland sounds like when someone has decided to be kind to it without having anything personally invested in the outcome. Radio Freedom, the Minutemen's radio station established in Fallout 4 when the player rebuilds the organization, begins as propaganda and becomes something more interesting over time. It is explicitly a recruitment tool and a morale operation, but it is a morale operation for an organization that actually needs morale, and there is something moving about watching a community develop the institutional confidence to maintain its own radio station, to decide that it has things worth saying and people worth saying them to. The role of radio in the Fallout universe is a version of something the franchise is always exploring: the question of what survives from the old world into the new one, and whether what survives is serving the people who inherit it. The music survives. The voices survive, sometimes as recordings, sometimes as the actual personalities behind them. Three Dog was operating his station for years before the events of Fallout 3, in a world that gave him no particular reason to believe his audience was large or responsive, or that his broadcasts were reaching anyone who needed them. He kept broadcasting anyway. That is what makes him a hero in the most functional sense of the word. Not his courage under fire, though he has that, but his willingness to keep performing an act of faith in the absence of evidence that the faith is warranted. The instruments that the wasteland has produced for making its own music, the tribal chants heard from some communities, the improvised instruments built from salvaged materials, the handful of professional musicians encountered throughout the games who are working out what music means in an environment where most of the conditions that produced it no longer exist, represent the other side of the inherited, pre-war audio culture. The past speaks through the radio. The present speaks through whatever people make with their hands from what the past left behind. The conversation between those two things, playing out across every game in the franchise, is the sound of civilization being renegotiated. Extended section, the television series, and the expanding canon. When the Fallout television series premiered in 2024, it entered a franchise that had been building its world for nearly 3 decades, and that had accumulated an enormous amount of lore across its games. The production team's challenge was to tell a story that could be understood by people who had never played any of the games, while also being satisfying to people who had played all of them, and to do that without contradicting the established canon in ways that would feel dismissive of the investment longtime fans had made. The series succeeded at this in ways that the games themselves had not always managed to achieve. The 3 central characters, Lucy McLean, a vault dweller from Vault 33, Maximus, a Brotherhood of Steel squire, and the Ghoul, a pre-war bounty hunter named Cooper Howard, who had been living in the wasteland for 200 years, each represent a different relationship to the post-war world, and their interweaving stories provide a structural tour of the franchise's major themes without ever feeling like a guided tour. Lucy is the naive optimist who discovers that the world outside her vault is worse and more complicated than she was told, but who refuses to let that discovery make her cynical. Her arc across the first season is the classic Fallout player character arc, the newcomer to the wasteland, the confrontation with its realities, the gradual development of the skills and relationships needed to survive, told with more psychological depth than a game can usually achieve, because the series has the time to let it breathe. Her father's choices, which drive the central plot, raise exactly the question that the Fallout franchise has always been raising. What are people capable of justifying to themselves when they believe they are protecting something important? Maximus is the most sympathetic depiction of a Brotherhood of Steel member the franchise has produced, and he works as a character because he is someone who joined the Brotherhood for the worst possible reasons, not because he believes in the mission, but because he wanted the armor and the power and the security, and who discovers, over the course of the season, that belief might be required after all. His trajectory is a compressed version of the organization's own history, the acquisition of power without the philosophical foundation to use it responsibly, followed by the painful discovery that the foundation matters. The ghoul Cooper Howard before the war, a Hollywood cowboy actor who did not know what his wife worked on or what the company she worked for was planning, is the season's most quietly devastating character. 200 years old, sustained by a combination of radiation and whatever a ghoul needs to survive that the games have always left slightly mysterious, he carries the full weight of the pre-war world in his body. He remembers it not as history but as personal experience. The things the other characters encounter as ruins and records, he knows as places he went and people he loved. His bitterness is not abstract. It is the bitterness of someone who watched a world he believed in reveal that it had never quite been the thing he believed in, and then watched what replaced it, and has been managing the resulting emotional math for 2 centuries. The season's central revelation that Shady Sands, the NCR capital, was destroyed by a nuclear explosion, and that this explosion appears to have been engineered rather than accidental, arrives as the kind of lore-expanding moment that rewards longtime fans while not requiring them of newcomers. For anyone who played Fallout 2, Shady Sands was a living city with a history stretching back to the first game, and the knowledge that it was destroyed is genuinely affecting. For anyone watching the series without that background, the destruction of a city is still a tragedy, and the mystery of who caused it and why is still a compelling narrative hook. The series' confidence in the franchise's moral complexity, its refusal to make any faction simply good or simply evil, its insistence that the most important questions are the ones without easy answers, establishes it as a genuine extension of what the games have been doing, rather than a simplified adaptation of it. The Fallout universe is large enough to contain a television narrative without either simplifying itself or losing the qualities that made it worth adapting. Extended section. What remains the enduring questions? After everything, the bombs, the vaults, the factions, the centuries of rebuilding and destroying and rebuilding again, the Fallout franchise returns, in every game and every season, to the same set of questions. They are not comfortable questions. They do not have clean answers, but they are real questions, the kind that do not stop being relevant simply because circumstances change or because someone has tried to answer them before. The first question is about memory. What do you do with the knowledge of what was lost? The pre-war world was not good. It produced the bombs and the resource wars and Vault Tech and all of the specific institutional failures that culminated in the 23rd of October, 2077. But it also produced the music that plays on the Wasteland's radios and the books that survive in the ruins and the medicine that the followers work to preserve and the individual human relationships that people carry forward from the time before as anchors for who they are trying to be. The Wasteland survivors and their descendants do not have the option of simply discarding the pre-war world, because they are living in its ruins and using its technology and being shaped by its cultural remnants every single day. The question is not whether to remember, but how, which parts, for what purposes, and with what degree of honesty about what the world that produced those things also produced. The second question is about violence. The Wasteland is a violent place, and the franchise is honest about that. But it is also honest, in a way that some post-apocalyptic fiction is not, about the costs of violence, the physical cost, the psychological cost, the social cost of building a community on the foundation of people who are good at hurting other people. Every faction that achieves stability through military dominance eventually confronts the question of what comes next, when the dominance is established and the question shifts from how to win to how to govern. The NCR faced it. The Brotherhood faces it in every game. Caesar's Legion was designed in a way that made it structurally incapable of facing it, which is why Caesar's own analysis of the Legion's future was so bleak. Violence can clear a space. It cannot fill one. The third question is about who counts. It is the question underneath all of the franchise's most contested moral territory. The debate about synths and personhood, the treatment of ghouls, the NCR's relationship with the tribal communities it absorbed, the Institute's relationship with the Wastelanders it studies and abducts. Every faction has an answer to this question, explicit or implicit, and the answers are doing enormous work in justifying what the faction does. The games are careful never to answer this question for the player definitively, because definitively answering it would turn a philosophical problem into a logistics problem, and the franchise understands that these are not the same thing. The fourth question, and perhaps the most personal one, the one that the player characters in each game are implicitly asked to answer through their choices, is about hope. Not optimism, which is a temperament, and not faith, which requires a specific object of belief, but hope as an active practice. The decision to act as if a better outcome is possible, knowing that it may not be, because the alternative is to accept that it is not, and to let that acceptance shape every subsequent choice. The Wasteland makes hope difficult in ways that are entirely reasonable. The evidence for hope is thin. The evidence against it is everywhere, in every ruin and every scar and every community that was building something and then got destroyed. And yet the games repeatedly position hope not as naivety, but as the most rigorous possible response to the evidence, because the alternative is to accept the worst reading of what human beings are capable of, and the Wasteland's history shows clearly enough what accepting that reading produces. The bombs fell, the world ended, and in the morning someone got up and started building something. Not because they knew it would work, not because they had been promised it would work, because they had decided that the attempt was worth making, regardless of the outcome, and that a life organized around that decision was more worth living than a life organized around its absence. 200 years later, someone else is making the same decision, and 200 years after that, in whatever stories the Fallout franchise tells next, someone will be making it again. That is the series' final answer to its own central question. Not that war never changes, though war never does, but that neither does the human impulse to try to make something worth living for out of whatever wreckage remains. The Wasteland is evidence of what happens when that impulse fails at the institutional level. Every community, every medical clinic, every radio broadcast, every settlement wall, every rescued synth, and every tended grave is evidence of it persisting anyway, at the level where it has always mattered most in individual people, making individual decisions, one at a time, across all the long and difficult years. Rest now. Let the Wasteland be quiet for a little while. The work will still be there in the morning, and so will the people doing it, and so will you. If this journey through the Fallout universe carried you somewhere peaceful tonight, thank you for being here. If you haven't already, a subscription keeps these stories coming, and drop a comment below with where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Sleep well and take good care of yourself wherever you are. Extended section. The Vaults Revisited. What the experiments revealed. There is a temptation, when cataloging the Vault experiments, to treat them as a list of horrors and move on. The list is genuinely horrifying. The Vault with only one overseer for 1,000 residents, designed to study the effects of unchecked authority. The Vault where everyone was issued a musical instrument with no instruction, on the theory that either musical civilization would spontaneously emerge or it would not. The Vault with a single man and 999 women, whose researchers apparently thought they were conducting an interesting sociological study. The Vault flooded with hallucinogens through the water supply. The Vault whose door never closed. But what makes the Vault experiments philosophically significant rather than simply disturbing is what they were actually designed to find out, which is the same thing that all of the franchise's major conflicts are designed to find out. What human beings are capable of under pressure, and what they are capable of not doing even under extraordinary pressure not to do it. Vault 81. Designed to develop cures for diseases by using the Vault residents as unwitting test subjects, failed to produce the intended results because the overseer responsible for actually administering the experiment refused to do it. He sabotaged the project rather than infect the people in his care, and the researchers who had designed the experiment documented this outcome as a failure without apparently noticing that it was also, from a different perspective, the most important result they could have obtained. A human being, placed in an institutional structure designed to produce a specific behavior and given every incentive to perform it, chose not to. That choice cost him something. He made it anyway. Vault 21 in New Vegas resolved all disputes by gambling, which sounds like dark comedy until you consider that gambling is a system for allocating resources and resolving conflicts through a mechanism that all parties have agreed to accept, and that the Vault's residents maintained this system for decades. It worked, after a fashion, until Mr. House sealed the Vault and removed the population to make use of the space. The gambling economy of the Vault 21 community was a genuinely functional social technology, imperfect and gameable and ultimately vulnerable to external power, but functional in the ways that mattered to the people living inside it. Vault 92, designed to study the effects of white noise on musician test subjects with the specific goal of producing aggressive behavior on cue, resulted in a massacre. The experiment worked, in the worst possible way. What is disturbing about this is not just the outcome but the design. Someone decided that producing controllable violence in human beings was a research goal worth pursuing, developed a methodology for it, and implemented it in a sealed environment with no exit. The massacre was the experiment completing itself. Whether the researchers considered that a success is a question the franchise leaves open, and the openness is the point. What Vault-Tec was ultimately building, across all of these experiments and all of these sealed communities, was not a survival program. It was a database. 100 vaults, each running a different variable, each generating data on human behavior under controlled conditions. The question of what that data was for what entity would eventually receive it and what decisions would be made on the basis of it is one of the franchise's most persistent unanswered questions, and the answer that most closely fits the available evidence is no one. The program was designed to generate data for a post-war authority that never materialized, run by an organization that was destroyed in the same catastrophe it had spent decades preparing to study. The experiments continued, in many cases, because the vaults were designed to continue them automatically, because the overseers had been given their instructions before the war and had no authority structure to report to afterward, because the system kept running after the people who built it were gone. That image, a research program continuing to generate data for a recipient that no longer exists, maintaining its protocols in the absence of any purpose. Those protocols were meant to serve as one of the most precise metaphors in the franchise for what institutions do when the conditions that produce them change beyond. Recognition. They keep running. The machinery of authority and hierarchy and procedure keeps operating even when the question it was designed to answer is no longer being asked. The Vault experiments are Vault-Tec's legacy in the most literal sense, the ongoing expression of a set of priorities and methods that outlasted the people who set them, shaping the lives of every person born inside those sealed walls without anyone in authority having made a conscious decision that this shaping should continue. The survivors who emerged from the vaults into the wasteland carried those experiments with them, in their psychology and their social habits, and the specific forms their community building took. The first NCR citizens came from vaults. The Great Khans came from a vault. The Boomers came from a vault. The Institute's founders were vault scientists. The vault experiment did not end when the doors opened. It continued in everything that the survivors built, shaped by the specific pressures and specific lessons of the specific vault they came from, spreading outward into the wasteland and becoming part of the broader experiment of post-war civilization without anyone ever using that word for it. What Vault-Tec wanted to know was what human beings do when you take everything away from them and put them somewhere small and controlled and full of pressure. The answer the wasteland gives 2 centuries later is everything. They do everything. They build cities and they burn them. They form governments and they betray them. They care for strangers and they exploit them. They make music and they make weapons and they make laws and they break all of them and they get up the next morning and try again. The experiments are still running. They are called civilization, and the data is still being generated, one human choice at a time, in every corner of the irradiated and stubborn and inexhaustible world that the bombs left behind. The bombs fell in 2 hours. The reckoning has been going on for 200 years. And somewhere out in the wasteland tonight, under a sky that still occasionally glows with colors no pre-war person would have recognized, someone is sitting next to a fire they built with their own hands in a settlement they helped raise from rubble, thinking about tomorrow. Not because tomorrow is promised, not because the odds favor it, but because the fire is warm and the night is long, and some part of them, some stubborn and unkillable part, has decided that tomorrow is worth thinking about. That is the Fallout universe in its entirety. That one small fire, that one quiet decision, repeated endlessly by everyone who survived.